Hey guys, tonight we're stepping straight into the harsh reality of medieval life. Not to marvel at knights or castles, but to uncover the raw truth about shoes in the Middle Ages and why you'd never complain about your sneakers again after just one day back then. While we take comfort for granted, people once walked miles in soaked, battered, painful shoes, or even worse, barefoot on frozen ground. So before we get started, hit like and subscribe, only if these intense stories intrigue you, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is now. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's journey together into a world where every step was pure survival. Shoes had no left or right. Imagine waking every morning to walk cobbled streets, muddy lanes, or stony fields, knowing your first step will always hurt. In the medieval world, this pain was ordinary, a fact of life that no one questioned. It began and ended with the shoes on your feet, stiff, unyielding, almost identical from one to the next. Look closely, and you'll find a strange truth. Most shoes, from surf to night, were made with no left or right, only two slabs of stitched leather shaped alike, as if the foot itself was a single, undivided thing. It's easy to laugh now, seeing the crude shapes in museums, clunky, flat, with no sense of curve or contour. But for centuries, this was the standard. Shoemakers, called cordwainers or cobblers, worked from simple patterns. Cut two pieces, sew them up, stitch on a sole, and call it a pair. The same shoe fit either foot or both feet badly. No one received custom-fitted, anatomically correct shoes. That luxury belonged to another age, centuries away. Why did it happen this way? The answer lies in practicality, poverty, and a world where speed, not comfort, shaped every daily choice. Leather was expensive, tools were simple, and time was precious. Most villagers owned only a single pair, often handed down, patched and resoled, expected to last through mud, rain, and endless labor. A symmetrical shoe could be swapped from foot to foot, extending its life. When the sole wore thin on one side, you just switched shoes. If one split, you patched it or stuffed it with rags. No one could afford waste. Imagine the consequences. Children learned to walk with a shuffle, never quite steady, always aware of the ache growing from heel to toe. Blisters were common, sometimes so raw they bled. Calluses formed like armor. In winter, cold air crept in through loose seams, numbing the toes. In summer, sweat and grit mixed into the cracks. For the poor, there was no choice at all. Some went barefoot, preferring the stones to the torment of poorly made shoes. For the wealthy, there were fancier styles, pointed toes, dyed leather, even velvet slippers. But symmetry remained. Left and right still did not exist, not in the world of shoes. Fashion sometimes made things worse. In the late Middle Ages, the craze for poulaines, shoes with long, curling points, swept through Europe's noble courts. These too were made without regard for the natural foot. The longer the point, the greater the discomfort. Some nobles stuffed the tips with moss or wool. Others tripped and stumbled, sacrificing balance for style. Laws were passed to limit the length of shoes, but the madness persisted. Even the best dressed suffered for their vanity, their feet crammed into shapes nature never intended. Blisters, bunions, and twisted toes became the norm. Chronic foot pain was everywhere, unspoken but universal. Medical texts from the era rarely mention it. Suffering was simply accepted. Traveling preachers and wandering minstrels limped from town to town. Soldiers marched for days in agony, their feet wrapped in dirty cloth, wounds festering beneath the leather. Pilgrims limped along muddy roads to holy shrines, leaving trails of blood and broken shoes behind them. There was no relief indoors. Medieval floors were rarely smooth. Packed earth, uneven boards, or cold stone. Slippers were just as crude as outdoor shoes. For most, the shoes never came off except at bedtime. At night, villagers rubbed their feet with animal fat, packed wounds with herbs, and prayed the pain would fade by morning. Some ingenious souls tried to innovate. Local cobblers experimented with softer leather, extra padding, or even crude attempts at shaping a left and right, but mass production, such as it was, favored simplicity. Shoemaking remained a communal skill, passed from parent to child, learned through necessity and scarcity. A symmetrical shoe meant one pattern, one solution for everyone, from field worker to craftsman to merchant. Foot pain shaped every aspect of daily life. Work was slower, journeys were shorter, tempers shorter still. Chronic discomfort bred patience or bitterness or a stoic humor. Folk remedies abounded, soaking feet in warm ale, rubbing with nettles, binding wounds with linen strips. The stories of saints and sinners alike mention nothing of comfort, only of endurance, the quiet, constant endurance of those who walked through life in shoes that never quite fit. It wasn't until the dawn of the modern age that change crept in. Shoemakers in Renaissance Italy and elsewhere began to experiment with curved lasts, wooden molds shaped to the left and right foot. Anatomists published drawings revealing the true shape of the human soul. Still, the old ways lingered for generations. Even in the 18th and 19th centuries, many working-class shoes remained stubbornly symmetrical, made to last, not to soothe. Yet the mark remains. Visit a museum, run your hand along the old leather, and you can almost feel the ghosts of those who wore them, step after aching step, day after day, through mud and snow, into fields and marketplaces, through war and famine and hope and prayer. The shoes tell a story of human resilience, a reminder that comfort for most of history was a luxury few could afford. It's a lesson hidden in every blister, every twisted toe. The simplest things we now take for granted were once hard-won, paid for in quiet pain and patient endurance. So next time you slip on a shoe that hugs your arch and cushions your heel, remember those who came before, who faced the world 2 sore feet at a time and kept walking anyway. For them, every journey was a testament, not to where they went, but to what they endured along the way. Soles were paper-thin leather. Imagine the first step outside your door each morning, not onto polished floorboards or clean stone, but into the unpredictable chaos of a medieval street. The ground beneath you is uneven, the surface scattered with rocks, splinters, mud, and far worse. Your only protection? A shoe with a sole scarcely thicker than a piece of parchment, a scrap of leather, worn thin by months or years of use, soft as paper, barely stitched to an upper that clings to your foot like a second fragile skin. This is not a luxury or a fashion statement. It is necessity at its barest, and for most people, there is no other choice. Medieval shoes were a marvel of simplicity, but their limitations were obvious to anyone forced to walk more than a few steps in them. In an age before rubber, plastics, or factory-made soles, the best most people could hope for was a single, thin slice of leather, hand-cut and hammered flat. Some shoes, like the pointed poulens or the broad-toed slippers of the wealthy, offered a little more style, but the basic truth remained. The sole was thin, soft, and wore down quickly. For peasants, townsfolk, servants, and even children, a new pair was rare, often handed down, patched, or mended until it fell apart. When it rained, the soles soaked through in minutes. When it froze, they stiffened and cracked. And all the while, every step was a negotiation with the ground beneath. Picture yourself weaving through a crowded market or along the muddy lanes of a village at harvest time. The street is not just dirt, but a living river of refuse, pebbles and sharp rocks, splinters from broken carts, the hard-dried ridges of last week's ruts, and puddles that mask unseen dangers below. And everywhere, the filth. Animal droppings from oxen and horses, scraps of spoiled food, pools of wastewater flung from windows and doors. Even a gentle stroll is an obstacle course, and your feet feel every stone, every twig, every bit of grit through the insubstantial barrier of your shoe. Injury is inevitable. One wrong step, and a stone bruises the ball of your foot. A nail or broken shard slices through leather and skin alike. Infection is always lurking, ready to claim a careless walker. In summer, the ground burns your soles. In winter, the cold seeps through, numbing your toes until you can no longer tell whether you are wounded or simply frozen. Blisters and calluses become badges of survival, constant companions for the poor and privileged alike. For many, barefoot was preferable, at least in summer, at least at home. But in towns or during the long marches of work and war, a shoe, however thin, was necessary. The cheapest shoes were little more than turn shoes. A single piece of leather, stitched inside out, then flipped and worn until the sole all but dissolved. Some tried to pad their shoes with moss, cloth, or straw, anything to buy a few more days of comfort or keep the worst of the mud at bay. Others simply endured, limping from cut to bruise, washing their feet in cold water each night, praying for no sign of infection or rot. The wealthy fared little better in practice. Their shoes were finer, often softer, sometimes adorned with decorative slashes or pointed toes, but the soles were just as thin. A lord's delicate slippers, worn for court, were disastrous outdoors, good only for the cleanest flagstones or the swept floors of a manor. On campaign, even knights wore simple ankle boots, knowing that a long march would reduce the toughest leather to rags. Soldiers in muddy fields suffered not just from the enemy's blades, but from the ground itself, feet split and bleeding, toes blackened by cold, sometimes lost entirely to infection and frostbite. There were efforts to improve matters, sometimes wooden pattens, strapped over shoes to raise the wearer above the worst of the muck, but these were awkward, slippery, and often more trouble than they were worth. Cobblers' shops did a brisk trade in repairs, but new shoes were expensive, labor-intensive, and far from durable. Many people went years between pairs, and some never owned a proper shoe in their entire life. The danger was constant. Every journey, whether to market or church or the distant fields, was a calculated risk. Mothers warned children to watch their step, to avoid the filthiest alleys and the sharpest stones. In cities, foot injuries were a daily complaint. A stubbed toe, a gash, a festering wound that lingered for months. In a world without antibiotics, even a small cut could become a death sentence. Monks and nuns cared for the wounded, washing feet in herbal water, praying against infection, but their resources were limited. Records from medieval hospitals are full of foot ailments, abscesses, ulcers, blood poisoning, direct results of living in a world where the only shield between flesh and filth was a paper-thin strip of leather. Yet the people adapted. Their feet toughened, the skin thickening and hardening until it was almost another sole. Walking became a skill, a careful dance of balance and instinct, learning to avoid the sharpest dangers, to recognize the change in ground by feel alone. Still, every step was a reminder of how vulnerable you were, how thin the margin was between health and harm. Modern shoes, with their cushioned soles and waterproof linings, are a kind of silent miracle, one that most of us take for granted. We forget what it meant to live each day in negotiation with the world beneath our feet, to measure distance not by miles, but by pain and endurance. The next time you slip on your sneakers or step confidently across a busy street, remember the millions who walked before you, who braved a world of stones and mud and disease with nothing but a whisper of leather to protect them. For them, every journey was an act of courage. Every return, a small victory. The soles of their shoes may have been paper thin, but their resilience was anything but. And so, beneath the dust of history, we walk in their footsteps, cushioned now by the layers of invention and comfort, but forever shaped by the dangers and hardships that our ancestors endured, one painful step at a time. Peasants often had no shoes at all. In our modern world, the idea of venturing outside without shoes, let alone working a field or walking through winter frost barefoot, feels almost unthinkable. Shoes are so basic, so ordinary, we rarely pause to consider their history. Yet for most people living in the villages of medieval Europe, shoes were not a birthright, not even an expectation. For millions, going barefoot was the only way of life, an unspoken truth that shaped their bodies, their health, and their daily reality in ways that are almost unimaginable to us now. Picture a peasant village at the edge of dawn. Mist clings to the furrows of tilled earth, and the chill in the air bites hard. Men, women, and children rise from straw pallets inside cramped timber cottages, the floors often nothing but trampled earth and old rushes. They step into the cold, their feet already roughened from years of exposure, already numb to pain most of us would call unbearable. In every direction, there is work to do. Fields to plow, weeds to pull, wood to gather, livestock to tend. And all of it is done on bare skin, exposed to the world. It wasn't that shoes were unknown. Wealthier villagers might own a pair, passed down and patched for generations, reserved for feast days or trips to the distant market. But for the vast majority, shoes were a luxury. Too expensive, too quickly worn out in the mud and stones of rural life, too difficult to replace. Even simple leather sandals were beyond the means of most. Many lived and died without ever feeling the inside of a shoe. They walked on hard-packed dirt, on frozen ground, through muddy ruts, on sharp stones, and burning summer soil, their soles slowly thickening into natural armor. But this armor was far from perfect. The human foot, exposed to endless hardship, adapted in ways that left marks both visible and hidden. To walk the fields barefoot meant constantly risking injury, splinters, cuts, thorns, and the jagged remnants of harvest. Wounds were common, and even the smallest could quickly fester. Medieval life offered no antiseptics, no antibiotics. A simple cut could mean days of fever and agony, the wound swelling with pus until it crippled the victim or killed them outright. Tetanus, blood poisoning, and gangrene haunted the barefoot poor, claiming countless lives quietly, off the record, out of sight of the chronicles that celebrated kings and conquerors. For those who survived, the damage was often permanent. Peasants' feet, especially those who started working the fields as children, grew twisted and malformed over time. Toes curled unnaturally. Nails grew thick and black. Bones shifted beneath the relentless assault of hard labor and cold. Archaeologists uncovering medieval graves frequently find skeletons with misshapen feet, evidence etched in bone of decades spent walking barefoot on the unforgiving earth. Medical texts from the period, rare as they are, describe the peasant's foot as a distinct deformity, calloused, splayed, scarred, and often crippled by chronic pain. The misery of winter was something else entirely. Imagine trudging barefoot through a frost-bitten field before sunrise, the ground hard as iron beneath your skin, the wind slashing through layers of rags. Frostbite was inevitable, a slow enemy that numbed the feet until skin turned pale and waxy, then blackened and died. Toes shriveled and fell away, joints stiffened, movement grew clumsy, and work became torture. Some villagers wrapped their feet in scraps of cloth or tied on wooden clogs in the harshest months, but for many, even that was out of reach. The damage accumulated season after season until even walking became an ordeal, and life shrank to the radius of what you could endure on ruined feet. Yet, for all its brutality, this barefoot existence was accepted as part of the natural order. Chroniclers rarely commented on it, except in moments of pity or horror. Visitors from wealthier towns described the bare, cracked feet of the villagers with a mixture of fascination and revulsion, but little changed. The church offered prayers, the lords offered nothing. A few towns sponsored charity shoemaking in the coldest years, but the need always outstripped the supply. To be barefoot was not just poverty, it was identity. It marked the villagers as separate from the world of merchants and nobles, as fundamentally expendable, as those whose suffering would never matter enough to mend. Still, there was resilience. The barefoot peasants of medieval Europe developed remarkable endurance. They learned to read the ground, to step lightly or boldly as the season demanded, to numb themselves against pain. Folktales spoke of those who could run across thorns without bleeding, who felt the weather change through their souls, who bore the weight of winter and hunger and never flinched. But these tales are less celebration than lament, a quiet recognition of how deprivation forces the body to adapt, but always at a cost. Disease, too, found easy entry. Foot infections, untreatable and sometimes undiagnosed, were among the invisible killers of medieval life. Skin broken by endless toil offered a gateway for every microbe lurking in the mud. Warts, fungus, and abscesses became lifelong companions. Even the act of walking, so basic, so unremarkable, became a daily gamble with injury, and with it, the slow, grinding threat of death. The cycle repeated itself with each generation. Children, their feet still soft and uncalloused, began work as soon as they could stand. Their first wounds were rites of passage, their first scars the price of survival. By the time they reached adulthood, their feet were so toughened they could barely remember a world without pain. By old age, if they made it that far, the damage was often complete, and every step was a reminder of decades of exposure. The absence of shoes was more than discomfort. It was a barrier to mobility and dignity. For peasants, to be barefoot in front of lords or clergy was to be marked as lesser. It shaped posture, movement, even the willingness to travel. Many peasants spent their entire lives within a handful of miles from where they were born, not because they lacked curiosity, but because their feet could not bear the journey. Despite all of this, the barefoot peasant remains almost invisible in the popular imagination. Medieval art, commissioned by the wealthy, often depicts workers with shoes they never owned. Chronicles written by clerks and lords rarely pause to mention the agony and resilience beneath the surface. Only the bones, unearthed centuries later, whisper the truth. The next time you slip on your shoes and step outside, pause for a moment. Imagine the raw, stinging cold of the earth against your skin, the 1,000 small wounds, the lifelong scars, the exhaustion that comes not from battle or plague, but from walking, day after day, year after year, with nothing between you and the world but your own flesh. This is the story of the barefoot peasant, a testament to endurance, to the quiet heroism of those who survived not in spite of hardship, but through it. And it's a story written not in ink, but in every twisted bone and weathered soul left behind beneath the fields they called home. Nobles wore shoes that crushed their toes. In the flickering candlelight of a medieval great hall, where silk-draped lords and jewel-laden ladies gathered beneath towering beams, a peculiar, almost grotesque fashion ruled the scene. A fashion so powerful it bent not only the customs of the court, but even the shape of the human body itself. The elite of Europe, desperate to display their taste and status, strode through palaces and city streets in shoes that seemed torn straight from the realm of fantasy or nightmare. Shoes called poulaines. Long, sharp, curling points, sometimes extending a foot or more past the actual toes. These shoes sliced through the air like talons, transforming feet into weapons of vanity and social warfare. But behind every grand entrance, every approving glance from the crowd, was a secret agony, one that would leave physical scars and medical nightmares that haunted their wearers for years. This was the strange, painful price of medieval fashion. To understand why nobles would willingly torture themselves for appearance, we must step inside the mind and the world of those who wore poulaines. The word poulaine comes from the phrase soulières à la poulaine, meaning shoes in the Polish style. By the late 1300s and throughout the 1400s, the trend swept across the courts of France, England, Burgundy, and beyond, riding a wave of aristocratic obsession with status and novelty. The longer and more elaborate the point, the higher one's rank was presumed to be. Kings and dukes competed in displays of wealth by donning shoes whose curled toes sometimes needed to be reinforced with whalebone, wire, or even gilded chains to keep them from dragging along the floor. Some points were so long that they had to be tied to the wearer's garters just to allow walking, transforming each step into an act of precarious, toe-crushing balance. For all their outward beauty, crafted from supple leather, velvet, and fine embroidery, the design of the poulain was, in truth, an instrument of quiet suffering. The foot itself did not rest in the tip. Instead, the wearer's toes were forced into an unnaturally narrow compartment, crammed together so tightly that they could barely move. Imagine slipping your foot into a glove made for a child, then stretching it with a rigid, unyielding claw. Day after day, month after month, the pressure would crush the toes inward, rubbing skin raw and forcing bones into unnatural positions. Blisters, bruised nails, and bleeding were common. Over time, chronic pain, bunions, and even irreversible deformities set in. Some nobles had their toes permanently bent or overlapped, twisted to match the unnatural arc of the shoes. Medical texts from the era describe feet misshapen like the claws of birds, their owners limping through the halls of power with forced grace. Why endure such agony? The answer, as with so much of history, lies in power and perception. In a society obsessed with hierarchy and display, fashion was not just ornament. It was a declaration. To wear poulaines was to proclaim that you did not need to work, to run, or to labor for your daily bread. You could afford to be slow, to glide through the world at your own pace. The exaggerated points, so difficult to walk in, became a symbol of leisure, wealth, and aristocratic detachment. To the commoners, who wore simple shoes built for function, poulaines were a mark of otherworldly privilege, a physical barrier as real as the moat around a castle. But the fashion was more than just a status symbol. It was a language of rivalry, an arms race in leather and bone. Chroniclers record entire courts measuring and boasting about the length of their points, with some going so far as to pass sumptuary laws limiting the allowable length based on social rank. A mere knight might be permitted a modest 6 inches, while a duke or king could command a full 12. Anyone who dared to violate these rules risked fines, or the humiliation of being forced to cut off the offending tips in public. The church, ever wary of vanity and excess, condemned the shoes as instruments of the devil, and sermons railed against the folly of crushing one's feet for fleeting pride. Physicians warned of the French gout, a catch-all term for the agonies suffered by those addicted to fashionable footwear. Yet none of this slowed the spread of the poulain. The image of the curled, pointed toe was irresistible. A weapon? A wand? a symbol of the unreachable heights of noble life. For those who wore them, the pain became a secret badge. In the privacy of their chambers, lords and ladies would peel off their shoes to reveal bruised, bloodied feet, soaking them in wine or rosewater to dull the ache. Some sought out apothecaries for salves and bandages. Others simply endured, unwilling to surrender their place in the silent competition of the court. Over time, the suffering became ritual, a hidden cost paid for beauty, prestige, and belonging. As with all extreme fashions, the reign of the poulain eventually ended. By the late 15th century, new styles swept across Europe, and the pointed shoe gave way to broad-toed slippers and heavy boots. The memory of the craze lingered in satire and rumor, a cautionary tale about the dangers of vanity. For centuries afterward, old bones unearthed from noble graves showed the legacy of the fashion. Feet still twisted in death, a last, silent testament to a style that crushed not only toes, but the boundaries between power and pain. Today, the image of the poulain, those bizarre, elongated shoes, remains an emblem of the strange extremes of human desire. It is easy to laugh, to marvel at the absurdity of the fashion. But behind the laughter is something more universal: the relentless drive to belong, to be seen, to rise above the ordinary, even at the cost of one's own comfort and well-being. So, the next time you slip on a pair of uncomfortable shoes for the sake of style, remember the nobles who limped through marble halls in agony, their toes crushed and twisted inside the proud, pointed silhouette of the poulain. Fashion has always had a price, and sometimes the echoes of that price linger long after the last step has been taken. Wet shoes were the norm. Imagine waking each morning in a world where every step you take brings the promise of discomfort, danger, and decay. For most of us, shoes are a simple barrier, a forgettable comfort that protects us from the hazards of the outside world. But in medieval times, that barrier was little more than a thin, imperfect shield against a relentless enemy: water. The reality of medieval life was not just cold stone and open fields. It was a world saturated by endless rain, muddy lanes, and the slow rot of wet leather pressing against skin. Wet shoes weren't an occasional inconvenience. They were a daily reality, a persistent misery, and for many, a direct path to suffering that few today could even imagine. Let's take a step into a medieval village, the ground already slick with rain from the night before. The houses, built from wood, wattle, and daub, are clustered close together along narrow, winding streets. There is no pavement, only earth, trampled by generations of feet, churned into mud with every passing storm. Water pools in every hollow, seeps into cellars, and overflows from sagging roofs. The air is heavy with the scent of wet earth and rotting straw. In this world, shoes, if you're lucky enough to have them, are a precious possession, but their protection is fleeting at best. Medieval shoes were made from rough leather, cut and stitched by hand, often by the wearer or a local cobbler whose skills were only as good as the tools and materials he could afford. There was no waterproof lining, no insulation, no rubber soles. Most shoes were simple turn shoes, stitched inside out, and then flipped so the seams faced inward. The soles were thin, offering little protection against sharp stones, and they absorbed water almost instantly. Step into a puddle on your way to the market or the church, and your shoes would suck up the cold moisture, clinging to your feet for hours or even days. It didn't matter if you were a peasant trudging to the fields or a nobleman walking through a castle courtyard. Rain fell on everyone, and leather, left untreated and exposed, was no match for weeks of drizzle or sudden downpours. Once soaked, shoes could take days to dry, days in which you would keep wearing them, each soggy step abrading your skin, creating perfect conditions for blisters to form and fester. There were no spares, no dry pairs waiting by the fire. Many people could only afford a single pair of shoes, passed down and patched until they were little more than stitched-together rags. Going barefoot was sometimes the only alternative, but that meant risking cuts, frostbite, or even more serious infections. And the consequences of wet shoes weren't just discomfort. They were a slow, creeping danger that could claim toes, feet, and, in the worst cases, lives. As you trudged through muddy roads and sodden fields, water softened the leather, causing it to warp and crack. Mold would bloom inside the shoes within days, spreading a damp, earthy smell that no amount of airing could remove. The warm, moist darkness became a breeding ground for bacteria and fungi, turning every shoe into a potential incubator for disease. Medieval chroniclers and doctors, when they bothered to mention such things at all, described feet swollen and raw, covered in blisters that soon broke and filled with pus. Minor wounds could quickly become infected, as there were no antiseptics, no antibiotics, and few effective remedies. A simple cut from a stone or the constant rubbing of wet leather could lead to ulceration, and from there, infection could spread up the leg. The unlucky might develop trench foot, a condition we associate with World War I, but which was a silent plague for centuries before that, whenever feet stayed wet for days at a time. In severe cases, gangrene would set in. Amputation, crude and agonizing, was often the only hope for survival. But most simply died. The problem of wet shoes reached every corner of society. In monasteries, monks walked barefoot as a form of penance, but in cold, wet climates, this led to illness, frostbite, and death. In cities, tanners and cobblers struggled to keep up with demand, working day and night to repair shoes worn to rags by endless rain. Children, growing too quickly for their families to keep up, wore shoes patched with scraps or simply waded through the muck without protection at all. Even soldiers, whose lives depended on the health of their feet, marched with sodden boots, suffering in silence until their bodies gave out. There were attempts at remedies, of course. Some smeared their shoes with animal fat or wax, hoping to repel water. Others stuffed their shoes with straw, moss, or rags, desperate to soak up the moisture. Wealthier folk might own overshoes, wooden pattens designed to lift the foot above the mud, but these were heavy, awkward, and often slipped off in the worst conditions. For most people, such solutions were fleeting at best. The rain always returned, the roads always flooded, and the shoes, once soaked, became heavy, cold burdens dragging at every step. The psychological weight of this daily misery can't be overstated. To walk through life in constant discomfort, knowing that each step might bring pain or infection, was an ever-present reminder of how fragile existence was. Children learned early to endure the sting of cold water and the ache of raw blisters. Adults carried on, limping to work, to church, to market, because there was no other choice. In this way, wet shoes became more than an inconvenience. They were a symbol of the struggle to survive in a world that cared little for comfort or safety. And still, life went on. People joked about their wet feet, traded tips on drying shoes by the fire, and shared remedies for blisters that rarely worked. Folk tales sprang up around the misery, stories of mischievous spirits who brought rain, or of witches who cursed the cobblers to fail at keeping shoes dry. But beneath the humor was an undercurrent of resignation, a recognition that the simplest things, a dry pair of shoes, a warm place by the fire, were precious beyond measure. Looking back, it's easy to underestimate the profound impact of something so small, so basic as wet shoes. But for the millions who lived and died in medieval Europe, this daily hardship shaped every journey, every task, every moment spent outside the fragile safety of their homes. It was a constant, gnawing discomfort that wore down body and spirit, a quiet but relentless adversary that made each step a test of endurance. So, the next time you slip your feet into warm, dry shoes and step out into a rainy world without a second thought, remember the people who had no such luxury. Imagine the squelch of sodden leather, the sting of blisters, the smell of mold rising from your only pair of shoes. In the grand sweep of history, it's easy to focus on battles, kings, and revolutions. But sometimes, it's the smallest, most personal struggles that tell us the most about what it truly meant to survive. In medieval times, wet shoes were the rule, not the exception. A daily reminder that even the most basic comforts could be hard-won, and that every step was paid for, in pain, patience, and perseverance. Foot rot was common among soldiers. There is a pain in history that rarely makes it into the chronicles, a suffering endured not in the clash of swords, but in every muddy step between battles. The medieval soldier's greatest enemy was often not the foe he faced on the field, but the long, relentless march that led him there. Before modern medicine, before the word trench foot existed, armies crossing Europe, the Holy Land, or the Wild North knew the agony of something just as brutal: foot rot. Picture the scene. The sky is iron gray, rain falling in icy sheets. Hundreds of soldiers trudge through mud so deep it threatens to suck the boots from their feet. These boots, if they even deserve the name, are little more than thin, stitched leather. No lining, no protection, just a barrier between raw flesh and the elements. Socks are rare, if worn at all, and water creeps in from every seam. After a few hours, the leather is saturated. After a day, it begins to rot. After a week, so do the feet inside. The first sign is numbness, a cold ache in the toes and heel, a tingling that never goes away. Next comes swelling, the skin turning pale, then mottled, then blotched with angry reds and purples. Soldiers hobble through the camps at night, boots squelching, feet burning with pain and itching with the need to scratch. When they pull off their boots, the smell is unmistakable, sour, foul, a mix of sweat, decay, and open wounds. Blisters form, then burst. Toes split and bleed. Nails turn black and fall away. For some, the skin sloughs off in strips, leaving raw muscle exposed to every grain of grit and splash of mud. Infection follows, pus oozing from cracks, fever setting in, and a steady gnawing pain that radiates up the legs with each step. All the while, the march continues. Stopping is not an option. The sergeant will not wait for a man with bad feet. To be left behind is to die, unremarked and unburied, in the cold ruts of a forgotten road. Medieval campaigns were nothing like the neat, drilled armies of later centuries. Supply lines were thin, roads were few, and the distances were staggering. Crusaders crossing the Alps or the Balkans, English archers slogging through the sodden fields of France, Teutonic knights trudging across the Baltic marshes, all faced days, weeks, sometimes months of relentless wet. The ground itself was an enemy. Rain-swollen rivers, flooded plains, tracks churned by thousands of boots and hooves. Even summer could bring misery, as streams and swamps flourished, and the boots never quite dried out. There was no cure. Remedies ranged from the hopeful to the absurd. Stuffing boots with straw or wool, rubbing feet with fat or herbs, tying rags around the toes for a few hours of comfort. Some commanders ordered daily foot inspections, making men strip to the skin before the whole company to check for rot. An indignity, but a necessary one. Most did nothing. Pain was part of the contract. Soldiers grew stoic, limping through the mud, teeth gritted, eyes fixed on the horizon. They cut holes in their boots to let water drain, risking worse injuries, but desperate for relief. Sometimes, the only escape was amputation. Field surgeons, with rusty knives and no understanding of germs, would cut away blackened toes or even half a foot to save the man's life. Infection was almost certain. Gangrene crept in where rot left off. Death, when it came, was slow and ugly. Yet even this was better than the alternative, watching your feet dissolve as you staggered on, hoping the enemy would end it quickly. The misery of foot rot wasn't limited to foot soldiers. Knights, too, suffered, especially on long sieges or forced marches, where heavy armor trapped sweat and rain, and boots soaked through beneath steel greaves. Horses fared little better, their hooves blistered and rotting in the same mud that ate human flesh. Commanders knew to fear not just swords, but the rain clouds gathering over the horizon, a sure sign that men would be lost not to battle, but to the quiet, unheroic war fought at ankle level. It was during the Crusades that chroniclers first began to take note. Men who set out from Europe, full of zeal, arrived in the Holy Land broken, limping, their feet raw and festering. Some returned home with permanent scars, toes missing, bones twisted from infection. Some never made it back at all, buried in mass graves beside roads that had claimed them not in glory, but in misery. The disease was so common that veterans recognized its signs at a glance, passing on hard-won advice: change your boots when you can, keep your feet dry, rest when possible, though these were luxuries few could afford. Foot rot shaped the outcome of entire campaigns. Marches slowed as more men dropped out, the sick clogging supply wagons and field hospitals. Morale plummeted. Armies expected to sweep through enemy territory instead crawled, every step marked by pain and the knowledge that each mile could cost a foot, a leg, a life. Commanders learned to fear not just the sword, but the endless, unseen enemy of water and mud. When the battles finally came, the pain did not stop. Men fought on ruined feet, their stance unsteady, their balance wrecked by wounds that would have been easily treated in another age. Afterward, the wounded limped home, the damage done, often crippled for life. There were no pensions, no medals for endurance, just the quiet, lifelong memory of each step taken in agony. Today, we remember the great clashes, the heroic charges, the banners, and the cries. But hidden in every story of victory or defeat is the unspoken suffering of those who marched through rot and ruin, whose most bitter foe was not the enemy's blade, but the mud beneath their boots. Foot rot was the curse of the medieval soldier, a daily, grinding torment that shaped the very course of wars and left its mark on every step of history. So next time you read of crusades, conquests, or the long marches of forgotten armies, remember the men who limped in silence, their feet dissolving with each muddy mile, and the pain that went unrecorded, except in the blisters, scars, and stories passed down in whispered warnings for those who dared follow the same road. Cobblers were too expensive for most. Imagine a world where every step you take is a calculation, not just against stones and filth, but against the slow, inevitable unraveling of the shoes on your feet. In medieval villages and crowded city alleys, shoes were not a choice, not a matter of comfort or style, but a hard-won, fragile possession, a barrier between survival and suffering. Yet for most people, shoes were nearly impossible to replace, and cobblers, with their cramped stalls and well-worn tools, were a distant hope, not an everyday solution. This is a world where scarcity defines daily life, and every pair of shoes tells a story of endurance, ingenuity, and quiet desperation. The cobbler's craft was revered, yet out of reach for the majority. In towns and cities, cobblers worked long hours, hunched over scraps of leather and bent nails, eyes red from lamp smoke and concentration. They could repair and fashion shoes, but only for those who could afford the luxury. A brand new pair of shoes was a sign of status, a mark of prosperity so rare that it caught the eye of neighbors and strangers alike. For a wealthy merchant or noble, it meant soft leather, sturdy soles, and a fresh start with each season. For everyone else, a visit to the cobbler was a gamble, a hope that the coin scraped together would be enough for a patch, a sole, a little more time. For peasants and the working poor, the story was harsher. Most shoes began life as cast-offs, handed down from older siblings or bought second-hand in the market, already creased and worn. When a shoe split, it was patched, stitched with whatever thread or twine was available, reinforced with scraps of old cloth, or held together with knots. As the soles wore thin, peasants padded them with moss, straw, or bits of fabric, anything to shield their feet from the harsh world below. In some households, a single pair of shoes was shared between several family members, rationed out for market days or church, hidden away from rain and thieves. The scarcity created a quiet, relentless anxiety. Each morning began with an inspection. Are the soles still holding? Will the patch last the day? Is there enough leather left for one more repair? In the muddy lanes of spring or the frozen ruts of winter, the limits of endurance were tested with every step. It was common to see shoes riddled with holes, toes peeking through the battered front, soles worn so thin that only a thin thread separated skin from the biting earth. For children, a new pair of shoes was almost unimaginable. They ran barefoot through the summer, saving precious footwear for the rare occasions when appearance mattered. Sometimes, shoes were stolen, not out of malice, but out of the grinding necessity that shaped medieval life. Market days and crowded festivals were dangerous for the poorly shod. A single moment of distraction, and a more desperate neighbor might walk away with your only protection. In cities, shoes were even stolen from doorways or sleeping travelers, their absence a cruel reminder of vulnerability. Laws and punishments for theft were harsh, but hunger and cold had a logic all their own. The lucky ones might find another cast-off, might barter for an old pair patched beyond recognition, might stitch together a makeshift shoe from whatever materials they could scavenge. The cobbler's shop, for many, was a place of last resort. Repairs were done at home when possible, using bone needles, fish gut, or whatever could be found. Only when shoes threatened to fall apart entirely, or when a task demanded something sturdier, a long journey, a wedding, a festival, would a peasant brave the cost and seek out the cobbler's help. The cobbler would inspect the shoes with a practiced eye, sometimes shaking his head at the hopelessness of another repair, sometimes offering a sympathetic price, more often reminding his customer that true replacement was a luxury few could afford. Even in towns where cobblers offered their services, demand always outstripped supply. The wealthy monopolized the best materials, leaving the poor to make do with scraps and cast-offs. Some cobblers operated on credit or barter, but debts mounted quickly, and shoes were repossessed if payment failed. A child seen barefoot in the street was not just a sign of poverty. It was an unspoken admission that the family had exhausted every option. Despite this hardship, people adapted. Feet became calloused, toughened by years of walking on stones, mud, and frozen ground. Ingenuity flourished. Old shoes became new in ways unrecognizable to the original maker. Layers of patch and stitch and hope woven together. In the quiet of evening, families gathered by the fire to repair what they could, sharing stories of shoes lost and found. Trades made in desperation. Journeys survived on soles thin as paper. When a new pair of shoes did arrive, by gift, inheritance, or rare purchase, it was celebrated, guarded, almost sacred. Shoes were hidden from thieves, set aside for special occasions, sometimes even blessed by priests for luck and protection. The luxury of comfort, of not feeling every sharp stone or icy puddle, was fleeting but precious. It shaped the rhythm of life, determined who could work, who could travel, who could dance at the fair, or walk to church in dignity. Modern shoes, so easily bought and replaced, are the inheritance of centuries of struggle. We walk in comfort now, forgetful of the generations who patched, mended, and sometimes went barefoot because the cobbler's price was beyond their reach. Their endurance lives on in the stories and the silent, tough resilience of every step. So the next time you lace up a new pair of shoes, pause and remember those who could not. Remember the cobbler's craft, honored but unattainable, both a promise and a reminder of how hard-won even the smallest comforts once were. In every worn sole and every stitched patch, there is a record of survival, of quiet ingenuity, and the hope that, someday, every step might be taken in safety and dignity. You could be jailed for wearing the wrong shoes. It's hard to imagine that something as simple as a pair of shoes could decide your fate. Yet, in the tangled streets and muddy lanes of medieval Europe, the shoes on your feet didn't just carry you through daily life. They broadcast your social rank, and in the eyes of the law, your very right to freedom itself. In an age where every stitch, every buckle, every sliver of leather carried meaning, the wrong footwear could mean more than gossip. It could mean a heavy fine, a public shaming, or even the cold, unyielding stone of a prison cell. This was the world shaped by sumptuary laws, regulations handed down from on high, designed to draw hard, visible lines between the classes. Lords and kings, jealous of their status and desperate to keep society's order unchallenged, issued edicts that dictated what every subject could wear, eat, or own. These laws were enforced with a zeal that often defied belief, and nowhere were they more absurd or more rigid than in the matter of shoes. To understand why, you have to picture the medieval obsession with order. Clothing was more than utility. It was a uniform, a badge, a declaration of place. In the city streets of London, Paris, Florence, and countless lesser towns, to dress above your station was seen as a kind of social rebellion, a threat to the natural hierarchy that kept the world spinning. Noblemen and clergy wore pointed shoes, curled and elongated at the toes, adorned with bright dyes and costly buckles. For them, the shoe was both ornament and status, proof that they could afford to waste leather on fashion rather than necessity. But for commoners, laborers, merchants, apprentices, the law was clear. Shoes must be plain, toes blunt, materials coarse and undyed. Any violation could arouse suspicion, the attention of local officials, or worse, the scrutiny of the watchful guilds who guarded privilege with jealous eyes. The chroniclers of the time record moments both comic and tragic. A weaver hauled before the town council for daring to sport crimson slippers. A miller's wife fined for wearing boots stitched in the style reserved for the gentry. But it wasn't always a slap on the wrist. Across England, France, Italy, and beyond, repeated violation of the shoe laws could mean something far more sinister. In London's bustling wards, offenders were summoned to the Guildhall, where judges demanded proof of birth and lineage. If they failed, they paid fines so steep they risked losing their livelihoods. In Florence, a baker's apprentice found with shoes curled too sharply at the toe, imitating the proud beaks of noble footwear, was marched through the streets barefoot, his offending shoes nailed above the city gate as a warning. In some German principalities, repeat offenders were imprisoned, left to ponder their transgression in the cold gloom, all for a fashion crime. But why did shoes, of all things, provoke such severity? The answer lies in the subtle language of appearance. Shoes were the first thing seen in the muddy lanes and crowded markets, a flash of color, a pointed toe, a soft leather strap. They signaled wealth and ambition, often before a word was spoken. And in a world where ambition was dangerous, Where moving too freely between the classes was a threat to power, the ruling elites saw the wrong shoes as a rebellion to be stamped out early. These laws were not enforced in secret. Town criers read them in the squares, their words echoing off the timbered houses. Parish priests reminded their flocks from the pulpit that God's order was reflected in the order of dress. Guilds kept their eyes peeled because to allow an outsider to dress above their place threatened the entire system of privilege and craft. At fairs and festivals, officials inspected the crowds, sometimes measuring toes with wooden rulers to ensure the limits were obeyed. A shoe with a toe too long, called a poulain, could mean a hefty penalty, even for the sons of merchants. Sumptuary laws also reflected deeper anxieties. As economies changed and trade blossomed, new wealth began to blur old lines. Merchants and artisans, flush with coin, could afford luxuries once reserved for the nobility. Rulers responded not by sharing power, but by tightening the rules. New laws, new punishments, new scrutiny. Shoes, belts, hats, cloaks. Everything became a marker. Everything a potential offense. The records are full of stories. A brewer imprisoned in Flanders for dyeing his shoes blue. A blacksmith's daughter in Florence arrested at dawn for wearing embroidered slippers meant for a noble's wedding. In some towns, those found guilty were forced to stand in the stocks, their criminal shoes displayed for all to see. Children taunted them. Neighbors whispered. And the message was clear: know your place or pay the price. Yet, for all their cruelty, sumptuary laws failed to suppress desire. The forbidden allure of fine shoes was too strong. Clandestine cobblers did a brisk trade in hidden fashion, shoes with secret linings, or clever toggles that could be disguised when inspectors drew near. Young men saved for years to buy a single pair, risking everything for a fleeting taste of privilege. Women stitched their own flourishes, painting their toes with ashes and berries to mimic the dyes of the court. The game was endless, the stakes high. In the end, the laws themselves became a source of mockery and resistance. Ballads were sung about clever peasants outwitting the watch. Satirical pamphlets circulated, poking fun at the lords whose own sons snuck into town in disguise to sample forbidden styles. The spirit of rebellion flickered in every carefully disguised shoe, every hidden stitch, a reminder that the urge to rise, to dream, to step out of one's assigned place is as old as humanity itself. Centuries later, the sumptuary laws faded away, worn down by the tides of revolution and change, but their echoes remain in the power of clothes to define, divide, and inspire envy. And the next time you slip on a pair of shoes, shoes you chose for yourself, free from fear, remember those who came before, who risked everything for the right to walk as they wished, and who sometimes paid the price for a dream measured in leather and lace, sharp rocks, torfeet. Open. Picture yourself walking through a medieval town at dawn. The air is thick with wood smoke, the sound of roosters crowing, and the distant rumble of wagon wheels on stone. For most, life begins not with comfort, but with hardship. The first challenge isn't the work that awaits, or the hunger gnawing at your belly. It's the road itself, the unforgiving path that must be crossed every day, every season, whether you are young or old, merchant or peasant, noble or beggar. Forget the neat cobbled lanes of historical dramas. The reality was far grittier and infinitely more painful. Most medieval roads were nothing more than trampled earth, beaten down by centuries of hooves and heavy carts. The richer parts of town sometimes saw a thin layer of river pebbles, but for the vast majority, the surface was a jagged mosaic of flint, broken brick, shattered pottery, discarded bones, and sharp-edged rocks carried in from the fields. Each step was a negotiation between balance, luck, and endurance. For most people, shoes were a fragile luxury. The common man's shoe, a simple turn show made of thin leather stitched inside out, offered little protection. It wore through in weeks, often sooner in wet weather, and rarely shielded against anything sharper than grass. Many children, and even adults during the summer, went barefoot, not by choice, but by necessity. The poorest might stuff scraps of wool or hay into worn-out soles, hoping to stave off the worst of the pain for another mile or two. The result was a population whose feet bore the silent scars of survival. Toes split and calloused, heels cracked and bleeding, arches bruised, sometimes swollen beyond recognition. For every noble in embroidered poulens, there were 100 farmers hobbling through life, feet permanently disfigured by the terrain beneath them. Sharp stones left their mark, not just in the momentary sting of a cut, but in lifelong damage that shaped posture, stride, and even the way people aged. Every trip beyond the home was a test of endurance. Children learned young to watch where they stepped, to avoid the worst patches of jagged debris. Accidents, though, were common and costly. A single misstep could mean a stone slicing deep into the sole, sometimes exposing bone or tendon. In a world without effective antibiotics, even a minor wound could spiral into deadly infection. A cut that festered became a portal for tetanus, gangrene, or the evil, as it was called, a creeping darkness that spread up the leg and, too often, ended with a funeral pyre outside the town gate. Merchants and travelers who spent their lives on the road paid a special price. Historical records from guilds and monastic infirmaries speak of men whose feet were so torn they could no longer stand, their soles hard as leather, yet split with open wounds. Some traveled with spare shoes tied to their belts, switching pairs as one wore through. Others stuffed their shoes with moss, fur, even parchment to cushion the constant bite of stone. When it rained, the mud softened the ground but hid new dangers, buried shards of glass, thorns, or the broken iron teeth of discarded tools waiting just beneath the surface. Medical texts of the era devote long chapters to the treatment of foot injuries. Recipes for salves made from goose fat, honey, and ground herbs promise to draw out infection and close wounds. But for many, healing was slow, imperfect, and never complete. The lucky healed with scars, the unlucky with limps, chronic pain, or the slow spread of infection. Some, unable to walk, were cast aside by families already teetering on the edge of starvation. To lose your feet was, quite literally, to lose your place in the world. Even the privileged were not immune. Royal courts might pave their grand processional roads, but beyond the gates, the world reverted to the same cruel geometry of stone and mud. Knights returning from war often found themselves hobbled by wounds not from battle, but from the journey home. There are accounts of princesses carried in litters, not just to preserve status, but to protect delicate, unscarred feet from the agony of unpaved roads. Over time, these injuries left their mark not just on bodies, but on culture itself. Artists carved saints and martyrs showing wounded feet as a sign of earthly suffering. Folk stories warned of the bloodstones that marked where the wicked or careless had fallen. In some villages, it was tradition to carry brides across thresholds, not for luck, but to spare her feet from the pain of entry on her wedding day. Archaeologists have uncovered skeletons with toe bones fused together, heel bones worn thin, and evidence of long-healed fractures, silent testimony to a lifetime spent battling the ground. These are the stories left out of tapestries and chronicles, but written indelibly in the bones of those who built and farmed and fought for their lives on medieval soil. Today, we cross asphalt streets and polished floors, protected by layers of rubber and science. But in the echo of every comfortable step, there is a ghost of those who came before, who measured distance not in miles, but in pain, in blood, and in the hard-won scars that never fully healed. So the next time you slip on a sturdy shoe or step barefoot onto cool tile, remember the millions who walked before you. Every step was a risk. Every journey, a testament to endurance. The sharp stones that tore their feet open were more than an inconvenience. They were a daily trial, a shaping force, and a silent witness to the hidden cost of survival in a world far rougher than we care to imagine. Shoes were stuffed with hay for warmth. Step into a medieval winter, and you'll feel cold that creeps through stone and bone alike. A chill that settles into the marrow, relentless and inescapable. It is a world without central heating, with drafty timber cottages, icy winds howling through thatched roofs, and floors that never truly dry. For most villagers, warmth was a luxury measured in minutes, not hours. The poorest suffered the most, forced to improvise with whatever nature grudgingly offered. Nowhere was this improvisation more evident or more desperate than in the shoes on their feet. When the cold set in, and the leather of their only shoes turned stiff and unforgiving, villagers stuffed them with hay, straw, or moss, hoping for a sliver of comfort against the biting frost. But this act of survival came with a price, one that lingered long after the thaw. Picture a small, smoky cottage on the edge of a frozen field. The fire is nothing more than a few glowing embers, barely enough to warm the hands huddled near it. The shoes resting by the hearth are battered, hand-stitched, handed down through generations, and patched so many times they barely resemble their original form. The soles are thin. The leather is cracked, hard as wood. In this setting, the cold doesn't just nip at your toes. It gnaws every hour, day and night. There are no thick woolen socks for the poor, no lined boots or soft fleece slippers. Instead, there is straw, gathered from the fields after harvest, or moss, pulled from stone walls and the bases of ancient trees. Both are crammed inside the shoes, pressed tight to the toes and heels, a fragile barrier against winter's assault. At first, this makeshift insulation offers some relief. The hay trap's a pocket of air, softening the blow of the cold. Moss, with its spongy texture, molds to the foot, offering a cushion where none existed before. For a brief time, the feet are not numb. The pain eases. A bit of sensation returns. Children learn the trick early, watching their parents layer in straw or hunt for dry moss before the freeze. It is a custom passed quietly through families, a ritual that feels almost hopeful. Something to do, something to try, when nothing else stands between you and frostbite. But the respite is always temporary. Straw and moss, once exposed to the sweat and warmth of a living body, begin to break down. Shoes in winter rarely have time to dry. The hay quickly soaks through with moisture, turning soft and slimy, clinging to toes and heels. Moss, which is often damp when gathered, soon starts to rot, giving off a pungent odor that lingers long after the shoes are removed. The result is a squelching, musty mess that chafes skin raw and fills the small, crowded living space with a sour, earthy scent. This smell, half rot, half earth, becomes part of the memory of winter itself. It follows villagers everywhere, to church, to market, to the fields and back. No matter how often shoes are emptied and refilled, the straw never seems dry enough, the moss never truly clean. The problem compounds each day as old stuffing is discarded and new, only slightly fresher, is added in. For the poorest, even this ritual can become a burden. There is never enough straw to waste, and every handful pressed into a shoe is one less for bedding, one less for animal fodder, one less for thatched repairs. The consequences go beyond discomfort and smell. Constant dampness breeds bacteria and fungi, leading to blisters, sores, and infections. Children, the elderly, and the sick are the first to suffer. Sores split open, refuse to heal, and in some cases, fester into serious wounds that threaten life and limb. But what is the alternative? To go without stuffing means risking frostbite, blackened toes, and the slow, agonizing loss of feet or fingers. There is no easy choice, only the persistent negotiation with suffering, day after day, winter after winter. Even those who could afford to stuff their shoes with wool, or to own more than one pair, were not immune. Wealth bought some relief, but not total escape. The wealthy still struggled with cold stone floors and the raw bite of winter. For the vast majority, the rituals of hay and moss were an equalizer, a shared hardship that transcended social class, if only for a season. Historians piecing together the details of medieval life often overlook these intimate bodily struggles. The big events, wars, plagues, the rise and fall of kings, overshadow the daily negotiations with cold and discomfort that shaped every waking moment for millions. Yet, in every account of rural hardship, there are hints of this relentless fight for warmth, complaints of aching feet, tales of ingenious remedies, and the ever-present detail of the smell that clung to boots and bodies alike. When we imagine medieval winters, we tend to picture snow-covered castles, roaring fires, and carolers braving the cold. The reality was far less romantic. It was a world of wet straw pressed between shivering toes, shoes that reeked of decay, and mornings that began with the dread of pulling on something cold, damp and alive with the scent of last night's struggle. This was the daily background of existence, the context in which every decision was made. From when to go outside, to how far one could walk, to whether a child could survive another frost. Next time you slip on warm socks and sturdy boots, think of those who went before you. The villagers who fought winter with nothing but scraps of nature and stubborn hope. Remember the crunch of frost underfoot, the squish of rotting moss, the bittersweet relief of insulation that only half worked. In the story of survival, it is not just the great feats of heroism that matter, but the quiet, daily acts of endurance. The desperate ingenuity stuffed into every shoe, year after year. In the silent battle against the cold, fungal infections were untreatable. Imagine slipping your feet into a pair of stiff leather shoes each morning. Shoes that are heavy with last night's sweat and yesterday's mud. Shoes that have never truly dried since the day you bought or inherited them. Now imagine knowing, even as you slide your toes inside, that you are entering a daily war you cannot win. A battle against invisible invaders, creeping and multiplying beneath your skin. In the medieval world, this battle was constant, and nearly always lost. Fungal infections were a fact of life, silent, spreading, untreatable. It begins as a faint itch, almost easy to ignore. By midday, that itch has become a slow burn, somewhere between your smallest toes, where the sweat pools and the air never moves. You try to wriggle your foot, seeking relief, but the boot is tight, unyielding. A cage of damp leather stitched more for endurance than comfort. For hours, you stand in a workshop, a market stall, or the frozen earth of a field, your feet soaking in their own heat and moisture. You dream of taking the shoes off, but that brings its own pain, exposing flesh already raw, already weeping, to the grit and filth of the world. By night, the skin has started to blister and peel, layers sloughing away to reveal tender red beneath. Sometimes the wounds crack open, leaking a thin, sticky fluid that stains both sock and shoe. Your toes swell, nails yellow and lift at the edges, a sour smell rising with every step. You know what's coming next, because you have seen it in your neighbors, in your parents, even in your children. In every village and every city street, people limp with the same secret, hiding their agony behind tired smiles and stoic shrugs. There is no escape because there is no cure. The medieval mind has only a faint understanding of infection. Fungus is a word centuries away from discovery. Priests and healers offer prayers, ointments of lard and garlic, powders made from old bones or charred herbs. Nothing works. Sometimes the treatments make it worse, binding the feet too tightly, trapping even more sweat and heat, inviting deeper infection. A few try to air their feet in the open, but shame and custom keep most from showing their wounds. The fungus thrives in the dark, in the wet, in the quiet places where hope withers. For the poor, the misery is relentless. Shoes are handed down, never new, always patched, stitched again and again until they barely hold together. There's no time or money for a second pair, so the same shoes are worn day after day, through summer heat and winter frost, the damp never leaving. In the cramped, smoky cottages, where large families crowd together for warmth, ventilation is a myth. The floor is dirt, often flooded or littered with straw. Even at night, the air is thick, humid, the perfect breeding ground for every spore and germ. Fungus spreads from person to person, from child to parent, from laborer to laborer, as inescapable as the weather. Among the wealthy, the pain takes on a different form. They have slippers of velvet, boots dyed with expensive colors, but the construction is no better. Symmetrical, flat, suffocating. Servants scrub the shoes, but can never truly cleanse them. At banquets, lords shift their feet beneath the table, fighting the urge to scratch, while beneath the silk and brocade, infection festers just the same. Mold grows in the corners of storerooms, creeps into linen closets, and takes root in every dark, damp place. No one, no matter their fortune, is immune. The consequences are not merely discomfort. As the days turn to weeks, small wounds grow larger, deepening into ulcers that ooze pus and blood. Toes fuse together or become so tender that every step sends a jolt of pain up the leg. Infections move deeper, sometimes reaching the bone, sometimes drawing in other sicknesses. The stench grows stronger. Flies gather at wounds. Rats, always watching, grow bolder. Some people lose their nails for good. A few lose toes entirely. The lucky recover after months of agony. Many never truly heal. Medical knowledge is helpless. The best advice is to keep feet clean and dry, an impossible request in a world of ceaseless labor, endless mud, and homes where firewood is too scarce to waste on drying shoes. Some herbalists recommend walking barefoot in dew, hoping the morning chill will draw out the evil. Others smear wounds with honey or clay. The treatments rarely succeed, but the effort is a kind of hope, a way of fighting back against a world that feels stacked against comfort. Over time, the pain changes people. Work slows. Tempers shorten. Families grow used to the sight of limping, wincing, hobbling neighbors. Children watch their parents pick at flaking skin, learning too soon that pain is ordinary. The elderly sit by the fire, feet wrapped in rags, quietly enduring as another winter creeps in. Faith is tested, patience worn thin, but life must go on. Still, the stories persist. In some villages, the local wise woman claims to have a charm or prayer for the burning foot. Pilgrims limp to holy shrines, offering coins and whispered pleas in hopes of relief. But the true miracle, the invention of medicine that could defeat the fungus, will not come for centuries. Until then, each generation passes its pain to the next, hidden in the silent shuffle of swollen, blistered feet. When you visit a museum and see the old shoes, cracked leather, flattened soles, misshapen and worn, remember what they carried. Not just the weight of a day's labor, but the invisible burden of pain, the slow, inescapable march of infection that no one could outrun. Every step was a lesson in endurance, every blister a reminder that sometimes the smallest enemy can bring down the mightiest spirit. In the world before medicine, before understanding, the body was its own battlefield. Fungal infections were untreatable, unrelenting, and everywhere. An invisible plague that crept in through the feet and left its mark on every life, every family, every corner of the medieval world. And still, they walked, because there was no other way. Peasant foot injuries were life-threatening. Picture a peasant at dawn, standing barefoot or in paper-thin shoes at the edge of a muddy lane. The air is sharp with cold, and the ground beneath their feet is littered with stones, thorns, animal bones, and the remnants of last night's rain. There is work to be done, fields to be tended, animals to be fed. There is no time, no luxury for caution. Each step is a negotiation with the land, a world alive with hidden dangers. One careless moment, one stray thorn or splinter beneath the skin, and a day's labor could spiral into a fight for life itself. In the world of the medieval poor, wounds were a fact of daily existence. Every footfall brought the risk of pain. The thin leather of a shoe, if it could be called that, was barely more than a gesture against the world below. Most days, people simply went barefoot, their soles hardened by years of walking on rough earth, but never truly protected. Fields held not just crops, but hidden barbs, blackthorn, hawthorn, rusted tools, sharp stones, even fragments of bone left from last year's slaughter. One misstep was all it took. At first, it might seem trivial. A scratch, a pinprick, a little blood wiped away on the hem of a ragged tunic. But for a peasant with no access to clean water, let alone medicine, there is always a moment of fear. Dirt gets in. Mud cakes over. The wound throbs, red and angry. There are no antiseptics, no knowledge of bacteria or infection. The village wise woman might offer a poultice of herbs, a whispered prayer, but resources are meager. Bandages are scraps of old linen, reused and never truly clean. As the days pass, the wound grows hot. The pain spreads, up the foot, into the ankle. The skin swells, turns dark. The fever sets in. Night after night, the injured struggle to sleep, shivering as sweat soaks their brow, teeth clenched against the relentless ache. Every heartbeat pumps poison further through the body. Family members watch in fear, powerless. They have seen this before, seen how a simple injury can blossom into death. Sometimes the infection spreads quickly. Sometimes it lingers, gnawing away at strength and hope. There is no doctor to call. Physicians, when they exist, serve only the wealthy, far removed from the struggles of the field or the stable. Monasteries offer some relief, but they are few and far between. Most villages rely on knowledge passed down by word of mouth. Clean the wound if you can. Pack it with honey or moldy bread. Hope for the best. In some places, desperate families might try burning the wound with a hot knife or cauterizing with ashes. Pain so intense it brings unconsciousness, but with only the slimmest chance of survival. The consequences of infection are stark and terrifying. If the wound festers, gangrene may set in. The flesh blackens, stinks. Limbs swell grotesquely. Without amputation, which itself is nearly a death sentence, the infection spreads, attacking the blood and organs. The sufferer drifts in and out of delirium, haunted by fever dreams, until finally, mercifully, the pain ends. The village buries another child, another mother, another worker, lost not to war or famine, but to a thorn, a splinter, a moment's carelessness. Sometimes, against all odds, the wound heals. The peasant limps through the rest of their life, foot twisted and tender, a constant reminder of how close death came. Stories of miraculous recoveries spread, fueling both faith and fatalism. Parents warn their children, step carefully, always. But in a world where bare feet and thin shoes are the norm, where every field and lane is filled with hidden blades, caution is never enough. The loss of a foot, or even a toe, is a catastrophe. In a society where every able body is needed to survive, an injury that leaves someone unable to work can doom an entire family. Fields go untended, food is left unharvested, debts go unpaid. The wounded become burdens or beggars, their future narrowed to whatever charity neighbors can spare. Even a minor limp is enough to make the difference between survival and starvation. Medieval chronicles rarely mention these quiet tragedies. The deaths of kings, the clash of armies, the sweep of famine. These fill the records. But the everyday dangers, the invisible toll of peasant life, are written only in the memory of those who survived. Archaeologists find the evidence centuries later. Bones marked with signs of infection, feet deformed by ancient wounds, skeletons with missing toes, signs of primitive amputation. Each one is a silent testament to the struggle that played out day after day on the margins of history. And yet, through all this, life continued. Peasants endured, through pain, through fear, through the ever-present risk that tomorrow's step could be the one that ends it all. Ingenuity and resilience became the tools of survival. They learned to recognize which wounds could be ignored and which might be fatal, to seek out the safest path in a landscape indifferent to their pain. Community mattered. Neighbors looked after one another, sharing what little they had, because they all knew how thin the line was between health and disaster. Today, it is hard to fathom such vulnerability. A scratch or cut is a trivial matter, cleaned and bandaged in moments, forgotten by the next day. We walk on pavement, protected by thick soles, surrounded by the invisible safety net of modern medicine. Yet the world our ancestors walked was sharper, harder, and far more dangerous than we remember. So, next time you walk without thinking, spare a moment for those who could not. For whom every step was an act of courage, for whom the world beneath their feet was as perilous as any battlefield. The story of the peasant's foot injury is not just a tale of pain and loss. It is a reminder of the silent, daily heroism of survival, and of how easily a single, unseen danger could change the fate of a life, a family, even a village. Shoes were held together by hope. Sometimes, the difference between dignity and despair was measured in little more than a length of string, a bent nail, or the stubborn hope that tomorrow would somehow be kinder to your feet. In the world of the medieval peasant, shoes were never just shoes. They were patched-up companions, fragile shields against a brutal earth, tokens of luck, status, and relentless improvisation. Most days, they were held together not by skilled craft, but by desperate ingenuity and the thin, invisible thread of hope. Picture the morning. A village just stirring awake, the air cold and heavy with dew, and the only thing between your skin and the rough ground is a battered pair of shoes, if you were lucky enough to have them at all. Leather, worn thin as paper, already curling at the toe. Soles flapping open like a broken mouth. Laces snapped and frayed, knotted and retied so many times they looked more like a child's tangle of string than anything made by a cobbler's hand. Shoes, for the poor and working folk, were never made to last. The best leather went to the wealthy, and the rest to whoever could afford the scraps. Each pair, stitched from offcuts and remnants, was fated from the start to fall apart. Rain soaked in, mud rotted the seams, and the constant friction of fieldwork, stone paths, and long marches to market wore holes before the season was out. In autumn, you might find yourself shoving straw or bits of wool into your shoes, praying the makeshift padding would hold until the next frost. Most people didn't have the luxury of proper laces. The ones that came with the shoe, if they did at all, rarely survived more than a few weeks. So, peasants scavenged for anything that could tie a shoe. Bits of twine, scraps of linen, strips torn from worn-out clothes, or even braided grass. On cold mornings, you could see knots upon knots, winding up the front of a peasant's shoe like a desperate charm, each knot a small, silent prayer that today the leather would hold. When the sole finally gave way, and it always did, it didn't mean the shoe was finished. Most villagers could not imagine simply discarding a broken pair. They became masters of improvisation, hammering tiny bent nails into the flapping soles, wrapping the entire shoe in string or animal sinew, or sewing thick patches onto the inside using a bone needle and whatever thread was at hand. Children, too, learned early that shoes weren't just worn. They were constantly repaired, a daily ritual of survival. Even these repairs were only temporary victories. The shoes might hold for another day, another week, but everyone knew the end was always looming. Feet would slip on muddy roads, water would seep through the patchwork, and a sharp stone could tear a hole that no needle could truly fix. There was an art to walking in broken shoes, placing your steps carefully, learning to curl your toes so they didn't poke through, pressing your heel against the sole just so, in hopes of keeping the whole contraption from unraveling before you reached the next village. In winter, when frost hardened the earth and the wind turned cruel, the problem became life-threatening. The cold found every gap, every hole, every place where leather had surrendered to time. People stuffed their shoes with moss or hay, tied rags around the outsides, or tucked their feet into the embers of dying fires at night, desperate for warmth. The pain of frostbite and chilblains was constant. Even the small luxury of shoes tied together with scraps was better than nothing, better than walking barefoot on ice, risking infection, losing toes, losing the very ability to work or survive. To wear shoes at all, no matter how battered, was to cling to a shred of dignity. Shoes marked the line between beggar and peasant, between having a place in the village and being truly destitute. Church records and chronicles sometimes noted when a pauper died without shoes, so unusual, so heartbreaking, that it was worth recording among the tally of deaths and harvests. Yet even among those with shoes, the shame of broken soles and ragged laces was ever present. People tried to hide their worst holes beneath extra cloth or mud, ashamed to show how close they lived to the edge. Children rarely had shoes that fit. They inherited whatever their parents had worn out, with holes already worn through, the leather misshapen by years of another's steps. Young feet grew twisted and calloused as they tried to fit the ghost shape of the previous owner, learning early that pain was simply a part of daily life. In some families, shoes were handed down until they fell to pieces, a strange sort of heirloom, made precious not by beauty but by necessity and memory. Cobblers, when they could be found, were both saviors and reminders of scarcity. Few peasants could pay for new shoes, so the cobbler's trade was often one of constant patchwork, mending, renailing, reinforcing. Some cobblers specialized in making clump-soled shoes, binding extra pieces of wood or thick leather to the bottom to extend the life of an otherwise ruined pair. Still, for most, there was little choice but to repair what they had, again and again, as long as possible. Yet, in all this hardship, hope persisted. There was hope in the knot tied before dawn, hope in the patch stitched by candlelight, hope in every borrowed length of string or found nail. Every peasant who walked to the fields in broken shoes, every mother who mended a child's torn sole, every father who scavenged a bit of wire from the blacksmith's discard pile, all carried the silent determination that tomorrow, somehow, they would manage another day. Medieval shoes were fragile things, but those who wore them were anything but. Their resilience was measured not in the thickness of leather, but in the refusal to give up, the endless inventiveness of survival. In the echoes of every cobblestone lane, every muddy path, every frostbitten field, you can still hear the sound of hope. Frayed, battered, but unbroken, holding lives together, one step at a time. Pointy shoes were a status weapon. In the golden-lit courts and bustling banquet halls of late medieval Europe, power was not just a matter of birth or conquest. It was on vivid, unmissable display at your very feet. For nobles, every inch of their public self was a contest of spectacle. Their most bizarre and ruthless weapon in this fashion arms race was not a jeweled sword or a golden crown, but something far stranger: the pointy shoe, the infamous poulain. At first glance, these shoes might seem little more than a curious fashion statement, comical or impractical to modern eyes. But to walk the halls of power in the 14th and 15th centuries was to step into a world where status was measured in inches, and specifically, in the outrageous length of your shoe's tip. The longer and sharper the toe, the higher your place in the social hierarchy. Some poulains stretched so far ahead that their owners struggled to walk at all, their tips dangling and curling like the claws of some mythic bird. But this wasn't merely an affectation. It was a public challenge, an ever-present reminder to everyone who saw them that here was a man or woman above the crowd. The lengths themselves became a form of social code, policed with as much rigor as a family crest or coat of arms. Dukes, princes, and kings boasted tips a foot or more in length, their every step a declaration that they were far removed from common toil. Lesser nobles tried to follow suit, but sumptuary laws, edicts designed to keep social boundaries clear, often dictated maximum lengths for lesser ranks. Shoemakers themselves became secret keepers and fashion advisors, their work a balancing act between ambition and the threat of royal displeasure. To flaunt a tip too long for your station was to invite mockery, fines, or worse. But what did it mean, day to day, to live with this strange symbol strapped to your feet? The answer lies in ritual humiliation and spectacle. Because the shoes were so long, nobles could barely manage a dignified stride on their own. To prevent tripping, the elite turned to their most visible sign of status, the servant. Every public procession became a theater of class and deference, with one or more attendants tasked with lifting, holding, or sometimes literally carrying the curling tips of their master's poulains as they walked. Imagine the scene: a grand banquet, stone floors echoing with music and laughter, and down the aisle sweeps a lord in flowing velvet, his shoes trailing a foot or more ahead, two attendants crouched beside him to keep his fashion from sending him sprawling. Sometimes, in the most crowded or ceremonial spaces, the tips were tied with silk cords to the wearer's knees, while servants adjusted and untied them as their master paused to greet a rival or raise a cup in salute. Every adjustment, every lift, every gentle cradling of a jeweled toe tip was a reminder of power, the kind that says, "I am so exalted, I cannot even walk unaided. My presence is a production." This was not a private misery, but a public drama. Chroniclers of the day noted the absurdity, but also the message. Nobles were set apart, not just by wealth or birth, but by their willingness to transform their own bodies into monuments of status. And for servants, forced to trail on hands and knees, the daily humiliation was both physical and symbolic. Their role was to erase the difficulty of their master's fashion, smoothing the way for effortless grandeur while themselves remaining invisible. But the dangers of this status weapon were all too real. On stone stairs or crowded streets, the tips of poulains were notorious for tripping their owners, leading to falls, broken bones, or public embarrassment. Some nobles developed peculiar, shuffling gaits, practicing for hours to master the art of not stepping on their own status. Satirical poems and plays poked fun at the pointy-toed peacocks, while moralists condemned the shoes as sinful excess. Even the church entered the fray, denouncing poulins as instruments of the devil, and accusing their wearers of pride, vanity, and a willful disregard for the suffering of the poor, who, it was implied, went barefoot so that the rich might parade. Despite these warnings, the poulain endured for nearly a century and a half, evolving into ever more elaborate forms. The most extreme pairs were reinforced with whalebone, wire, or even tiny metal bells. Some tips were filled with scented herbs or perfumed sponges to mask the smells of crowded halls. Others, designed for formal occasions, were studded with pearls or precious stones. Shoes became not just clothing, but extensions of the self, a kind of wearable proclamation, daring all rivals to measure up. It is easy, centuries later, to laugh at the absurdity of it all, but beneath the spectacle lies a darker truth. The pointy shoe was a weapon wielded in the daily war of status, a tool for enforcing the invisible walls of class. For the servants condemned to serve as shoe-bearers, the experience was a lesson in submission. For the wearers themselves, it was a form of self-mortification, proof that belonging to the elite meant enduring discomfort for the sake of image. The shoes were not just a fashion, they were a test, a daily, visible ordeal that only those with power could afford to pass. In the end, the poulain fell out of favor, replaced by broader, sturdier shoes as new fashions swept the courts. But for a generation, the pointy shoe reigned supreme. A reminder that in the world of the medieval elite, even the simple act of walking could become a battlefield of status. And every inch of leather, every held-up tip, was another front in the endless war for power. So next time you see a pair of outlandish designer shoes, or struggle through a crowded room in footwear that pinches or trips you, remember the nobles of the Middle Ages and their servants at heel. In every step, they made a statement that here in this hall, the real contest was not only for land or title, but for the right to rise, literally, above the crowd, one excruciating, exalted inch at a time. Barefoot punishments were real. To truly understand the cruel ingenuity of medieval justice, you have to look beyond the grand executions and public spectacles and examine the daily punishments that left their mark on the bodies and minds of ordinary people. In the world of feudal Europe, where authority was often enforced by pain and humiliation, some of the harshest penalties were reserved not just for murderers or traitors, but for the lowliest thieves, wayward children, or disobedient servants. One of the most enduring and excruciating punishments was also among the simplest: the order to go barefoot, not merely as a sign of shame, but as a living sentence carried out on the harshest ground the authorities could find. Imagine a cobblestone street on a cold, gray morning. Townsfolk gather, eager for a bit of drama to punctuate their day. At the center stands the accused, a thief caught in the act, or a servant judged defiant, or a young woman gossiped to have broken some small, invisible rule. In front of the gathered crowd, the local bailiff or master delivers the sentence. The shoes are stripped from the guilty, exposing feet pale and soft from the relative protection of worn leather. There are no appeals, no last-minute reprieves. Instead, the punishment is both immediate and personal, forcing the condemned to walk barefoot through a gauntlet designed to inflict pain, humiliation, and, sometimes, lasting injury. The method varied from village to village, but certain themes recurred across Europe. In some places, barefoot offenders were driven across sharp, frozen river stones, each step a new agony. The cold biting so deep, it felt as if their bones were splitting apart. Winter was the cruelest season. Frozen ground could cut flesh like glass, and bystanders, bundled against the cold, watched as purple toes and bloody heels left a trail behind. For repeat offenders, or those considered especially troublesome, the path led not across mere earth, but through deliberately placed thorns, brambles, or nettles. Town elders or the local priest might escort the punished along a track thick with hawthorn, blackberry, or stinging nettle, forcing them to walk slowly so that each thorn bit deep and each step became an ordeal. This was not mere sadism. In a world where prisons were rare and costly, public punishment served two purposes. They were meant to hurt, and they were meant to be seen. To walk barefoot before your neighbors was to be stripped not just of comfort, but of dignity. It was a public lesson in humility, a warning to others that disobedience or dishonesty would be answered not behind closed doors, but in the full glare of the village. Children watched. Parents whispered warnings. The spectacle etched itself into memory, a living deterrent more effective than any decree nailed to the church door. The pain was real, and so were the consequences. Thorns left puncture wounds that could easily become infected, especially when treated with nothing more than river water or a dirty cloth. In cold weather, feet could be frostbitten in minutes. Nerve damage and lost toenails were common. Sometimes the wounds festered, leading to days or weeks of limping agony. And for the poorest, those whose work depended on healthy feet, this could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Yet, for all its cruelty, barefoot punishment was favored for its efficiency and symbolism. Shoes were expensive. To lose them, even temporarily, was to be rendered vulnerable. Walking barefoot was a mark of poverty, servitude, or defeat, a reminder of one's place in the social order. For a thief, it was a reversal. The person who took from others was forced to give up their own protection, exposed before all. For a servant, it was a final humiliation, a master's power quite literally pressed into flesh. Church records and local chronicles preserve vivid accounts. In 1342, a miller's son in Flanders was made to walk barefoot through a patch of thorns after being caught stealing grain. Witnesses reported that his cries could be heard for miles. In German principalities, a disobedient maid was marched along the banks of an icy river, her feet blue and raw by the time she was allowed to stop. English manor courts sentenced children who lied or stole apples to run barefoot across gravel and sharp straw, a punishment remembered well into adulthood. Even in the warmth of summer, a barefoot walk along sun-baked cobbles or rocky roads could raise blisters, split skin, and leave permanent scars. The practice faded with the rise of more formal legal systems and the slow shift toward incarceration rather than immediate public pain. But in many rural areas, it survived well into the modern era, passed down as both punishment and tradition. Elders recalled the humiliation of seeing a neighbor hobbling home, bleeding and tear-streaked, shoes left hanging in the town square as a warning to all who passed. For those who endured it, barefoot punishment was never forgotten. It was a sentence that followed them long after the wounds healed, a daily reminder each time they put on their battered shoes, and a scar that made every step for weeks a silent penance. In a world obsessed with order, the pain of bare feet pressed against stone, thorns, or ice became an intimate lesson in the power of authority. And in every village, for generations, children grew up wary, never quite forgetting the sound of a neighbor's footsteps, bare and broken, echoing through the dawn. Shoemakers used animal guts and blood. Picture yourself in the heart of a medieval town, long before the world knew the sharp smell of factory rubber or the neat click of synthetic glue. Shoes are a necessity, but they are not made in silence or sterility. They are born in the noise, mud, and unmistakable stench of the shoemaker's quarter. Every step you take is haunted by the ghosts of animals, by the echoes of boiling, scraping, and stitching. The price of walking is written not in gold, but in blood and guts. The cobbler's workshop is nothing like a modern shopfront. It's a cramped, dimly lit room, with piles of hides stacked in corners, strips of animal sinew stretched across rafters, and a fire that never quite goes out. The air is heavy, thick with the iron tang of blood, the sour rot of fat and flesh, and the sharp bite of urine and ashes used in tanning. On the floor, scraps of bone and hoof mingle with old rags, offal, and bits of broken shoes waiting for repair or reuse. To make a shoe in this world is to be part butcher, part alchemist. The leather itself begins as skin, flayed from the bodies of cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. These raw hides are soaked in pits of water, urine, lime, and dung for days or weeks, slowly loosening hair and fat, preparing the fibers for the harsh life ahead. Tanners slosh through the muck, their hands stained black, their noses numb to the stench. The process is dangerous. Chemical burns and infections are common, and the smell never leaves the skin. But the real secret, the glue that binds everything together, comes from deeper inside the animal. There is no synthetic resin, no neat tube to squeeze. Instead, the shoemaker collects hooves, horns, gristle, and organs from the butcher's table. These are hacked into chunks and dumped into a cauldron set over a smoky fire. Hours of boiling reduce the mixture to a thick, gelatinous sludge, animal glue. Sometimes blood is added, thickening the brew and lending it a faintly metallic tang that will linger in the finished shoe. The glue is poured, bubbling and viscous, into waiting pots, where it cools into sticky amber lumps. The shoemaker works fast. This glue spoils quickly and must be used while it's fresh before it rots and breeds flies. With a thin knife, he spreads it onto strips of leather, pressing the layers together, stitching with sinew or gut. The smell is overpowering, sweet, sour, and sickly, clinging to the air and skin, to every shoe and hand that leaves the shop. Every pair of shoes carries this hidden legacy. They look sturdy, but beneath the surface, the glue and leather are always fighting decay. Rain and sweat seep into the seams, softening the glue until it oozes or flakes away. The shoes grow stiff, then limp, soles peeling from uppers, stitches slipping loose. The wearer's feet are stained and perfumed by the mingled ghosts of a dozen animals. On hot days, the shoes grow sticky. On cold ones, the glue cracks, letting in water and mud. The result is a constant cycle of repair, patching, gluing, resoling, and sometimes complete surrender to rot. No matter your rank, the smell betrays you. In a crowded tavern, the acrid scent of animal glue hangs beneath the tang of sweat and ale. In the manor hall, noble guests shift uneasily, boots and slippers reeking faintly of the slaughterhouse. Children come home with shoes already coming apart, mothers wrapping threadbare soles with strips of hide or cloth, hoping to make them last another week. For the poor, a shoe that holds together for a season is a minor miracle. For the wealthy, a brief inconvenience. The process stains the shoemaker as much as the shoe. Hands are red and raw, nails blackened, eyes rimmed with smoke. The workshop itself becomes an extension of the body, tools sharpened with bone, scraps swept aside with bare feet, every inch soaked in the business of turning death into something that walks and lives again. Apprentices learn quickly to ignore the pain and the smell, to keep their heads down, and to work fast, for time is always short, and the queue of barefoot villagers never ends. Occasionally, someone tries something new, mixing glue with flour, with honey, with egg whites, seeking a secret recipe that will make the shoe last. But the animal glue always returns. It is cheap, plentiful, and just strong enough. If it fails, the fault is not the shoemaker's, but the world's. The rain too hard, the road too rough, the owner too poor to afford anything better. Shoes are expected to fall apart. Blisters and split seams are as much a part of life as hunger or cold. Yet in this struggle, there is a strange sort of beauty. Each pair is unique, shaped by the hands that made it and the beast that gave it skin. The shoes become an archive of labor. Every scar, every stain, every stiff seam, a memory of the work and the world that shaped it. In their way, these shoes are as alive as the creatures from which they came, carrying the story of survival, resilience, and the daily dance with discomfort that defined medieval life. When you walk in modern comfort, in shoes that never stink of death or dissolve in the rain, remember the cost that once came with every step. The old shoemakers knew no other way, only animal guts and blood, the boil and the stink, the never-ending hope that this pair at least would carry you through one more season, one more journey, one more turn of the road before falling apart and returning, as all things do, to dust. You couldn't wear shoes in church if you were poor. Imagine the sound of a great bell ringing out across a gray, frost-laden morning. It calls the village together, not to market, nor to labor, but to church. In every season, in every weather, peasants gather from distant cottages and crowded lanes, trudging toward the high stone walls and arched doors of the parish. They come with their families, faces scrubbed, heads bowed, wrapped in rough wool and patched cloaks. Yet there is something else they must do before entering this sacred space. They must remove their shoes. For the poor, this was not just a tradition, it was a mandate, inscribed in the rules of certain churches across medieval Europe. Shoes, no matter how thin or battered, were a symbol of pride, of ownership, of protection from the world's cruelty. To go barefoot in church was a command, a reminder to the peasant class that humility was their greatest virtue, that in the eyes of God and the wealthy, all earthly defenses must be set aside before the altar. The shoes, patched, mended, often shared or borrowed, were left outside the door or in a shadowed porch, a silent testimony to the poverty and obedience of those who wore them. Picture the feeling as you step inside. The warmth of shoes replaced instantly by the sharp, icy bite of the stone floor. In winter, the cold seeps through skin and muscle, numbing toes and stiffening joints. In summer, the rough stone is still unforgiving, scraping calloused feet with every movement. Children huddle close to their mothers, trying to keep their feet off the floor. But it is impossible. The service is long, sometimes hours, and everyone must kneel, stand, and move in time with the ritual. Even the strongest grow weary as the cold gnaws at their bones. The rule is enforced with silent vigilance. The priest, robed in costly linen, surveys the congregation from the altar. The wealthy, allowed to keep their shoes on, stand apart, their feet safely shod. A subtle but powerful reminder of the lines drawn by society. For the poor, there is no escape from exposure. Their humility is visible in every shiver, every pale foot pressed against the icy stones. It is meant to humble, to teach submission, to make tangible the distance between those who have and those who do not. Yet there is more to this tradition than simple cruelty. In the language of the Church, removing one's shoes is an ancient act, echoing Moses at the burning bush, or penitence at holy shrines. Bare feet signify reverence, a stripping away of worldliness, a readiness to receive grace unguarded. For the peasant, however, it is rarely a choice. It is an order, one that marks the boundary between the sacred and the everyday, between dignity and humility, between belonging and exclusion. For some, the ritual is a point of pride, a badge of faithfulness. For others, it is a source of pain, shame, even resentment. Children weep quietly as the cold bites deeper. Elders struggle to rise from their knees, every movement a reminder of their lowly station. In some regions, the custom is so rigid that families arrive at the church door with feet already bare, having walked miles through mud, snow, or stone. The entrance to the sanctuary becomes a place of silent suffering, a threshold where pride is left behind, and only need and hope remain. The church, with its soaring ceilings and flickering candles, is supposed to be a place of comfort, of shelter from the storms of the world. But for the poor, it is often a place where suffering is sanctified, where every ache and chill is offered up as proof of humility. The sermons speak of reward in the next life, of patience, of the holiness of poverty. Yet the immediate, physical hardship is inescapable, an experience shared by generations, remembered long after the words of the priest have faded into the echoes of the stone. Archaeologists have found clues to these ancient customs, worn thresholds outside church doors, layers of old shoes left as offerings, or forgotten by those too sick or distracted to reclaim them. Chroniclers mention the rule in passing, noting the barefoot congregation as a mark of piety and order. But the human reality was starker. Frostbitten feet in January, blisters in July, a shared memory of standing together, exposed and equal in the eyes of God, but never in the eyes of their earthly neighbors. Over time, the custom faded, replaced by new rules and gentler expectations. Shoes became cheaper, more common, their symbolism lost to comfort and necessity. But in the memory of the countryside, in the stories told by grandmothers to grandchildren beside the hearth, the old tradition lingered. A reminder that faith was once measured not just by words, but by the willingness to suffer for something greater. The next time you step into a place of worship, think of the countless feet that crossed thresholds barefoot, braving cold and stone, leaving behind not just shoes, but pride and protection. Their humility was real, shaped by hardship and necessity. Their faith was carved into their bones, felt in every shiver, every prayer uttered with frozen lips. In their sacrifice is written a forgotten chapter of history, one where suffering was both a burden and, in its own way, a kind of grace. Pregnant women were barefoot by force. There are stories from history that sting long after the facts have faded, not because they are loud or bloody, but because they reveal the quiet, relentless ways suffering was sanctified and woven into the very fabric of everyday life. This is one of those stories, a story of mothers barefoot in pain, not by accident or poverty alone, but by decree, by the iron logic of ritual, by a society that turned hardship into holiness and sanctified the most vulnerable moments of a woman's life with acts of forced deprivation. In the rural villages and parishes of late medieval Europe, childbirth was a perilous, sacred ordeal. Survival was never guaranteed. Every birth was a gamble. Every mother's cry, a prayer hurled into the unknown. There were no doctors, only midwives and healers, and there were very few comforts. But for the poorest women, especially in regions where the church's grip was iron tight, there was another layer of hardship, one that began not in the body, but at the feet. It was an unspoken law, practiced quietly but enforced with certainty. In many communities, poor expectant mothers were forbidden from wearing shoes during labor. This wasn't a simple matter of poverty, though poverty was everywhere. It was a ritual, a tradition rooted in a tangled web of religious belief, local superstition, and social hierarchy. The act of going barefoot was meant to symbolize humility, suffering, and spiritual purity. It was a living sacrifice, an outward sign that the mother-to-be was submitting herself, body and soul, to the ordeal ahead, offering up her pain as a kind of prayer, as if suffering, made visible and physical, could buy mercy or ensure the child's safe arrival. The reasoning, if you could call it that, mixed scripture with folklore. Some claimed it echoed biblical humility, Moses told to remove his sandals before holy ground. Others whispered that the agony of bare feet on cold earth would purge sin, purify the birth, or draw divine attention to a house otherwise ignored by fortune. priests would intone that Christ himself walked barefoot to the cross, and that every mother in labor must tread the same path of self-denial. The reality was far more brutal. For these women, there was no comfort to be found in ritual. Labor often began on cold dirt floors, in unheated cottages open to the wind. Straw scattered to soften the ground did little to ward off the chill, and bare feet quickly grew numb with cold or sticky with the sweat of pain. In winter, the cold could seep so deep into bone that toes would cramp and swell, turning purple or blue. In summer, bare feet pressed against hard-packed earth and rough splinters, every movement a raw reminder that comfort was a privilege for someone else. Women were watched by neighbors, midwives, even parish elders to ensure the ritual was kept. The poorest had no choice. If a mother was caught wearing shoes, she could be scolded, shamed, or even denied the church's blessing for her child. Some regions believed that breaking the barefoot ritual risked a cursed birth, or marked the child as proud or unlucky. Stories circulated of infants born with clubbed feet or illness, punishments, so people said, for mothers who refused to show humility at the threshold of new life. Even after birth, the suffering did not end. New mothers, still weak, were sometimes expected to remain barefoot as they performed rituals of thanksgiving or purification, their feet cold and bruised, their bodies aching. The pain was not just physical, but deeply psychological, a lesson etched into flesh that their agony was necessary, even holy. In this twisted logic, a mother's suffering became a badge of righteousness, an offering to a God who, they were told, valued humility above all else. The cruelty of this tradition was doubled by its hypocrisy. In the homes of the wealthy, where priests and lords might visit, women labored in relative comfort, by the hearth, on soft furs, with slippers or stockings to shield them from the cold. The barefoot ritual was reserved for the poor, those whose pain could be safely ignored, or transformed into a spectacle of piety for others to admire. It was the suffering of others, made into a spectacle, a moral lesson whispered down from the pulpit and reinforced by neighbors who feared what would happen if the old ways were forgotten. Despite all this, women endured. They endured not because they believed the pain was holy, but because they had no choice. They clung to hope, to the company of other women, to the few comforts they could find: a gentle hand, a whispered song, the faint warmth of sunlight on a bare foot, the knowledge that, no matter what ritual decreed, they were not alone. Some midwives, quietly defiant, would sneak bits of wool or rags beneath a mother's feet, offering small mercies beneath the watchful eyes of the community. Yet, for all their endurance, the legacy of this forced suffering lingers. It's easy to look back and marvel at the cruelty of the past, to shake our heads at superstition, to tell ourselves we have learned better. But the story of the barefoot mother is a reminder. Pain is too often disguised as virtue, hardship too often spun as holiness, especially for those who have no power to say no. It is a story written not just in the dirt of cottage floors, but in the memories of every generation forced to believe that suffering is what makes us worthy. Today, we remember these mothers not as martyrs, but as survivors. Their story is a testament not to the sanctity of pain, but to the strength it takes to endure, to hope, and to dream of a world where new life is met not with cold and deprivation, but with care, dignity, and warmth. The barefoot ritual may have faded, but the lesson remains. True holiness is found not in forced suffering, but in the courage to love, protect, and cherish, even in the harshest of times. Shoes made from wood gave splinters. Across the medieval countryside, from the windswept lowlands of Flanders to the sodden fields of England and the dense, damp meadows of northern France, the daily battle with the land was relentless. For the peasants and laborers who carved a living from earth perpetually soaked by rain, mud was an adversary every bit as formidable as hunger or disease. The answer to this problem was practical, clever, and, ultimately, painful: the wooden shoe, or clog. At first glance, a pair of medieval clogs looks almost comical. Heavy, blocky, carved from alder or willow, designed less for elegance than for sheer, stubborn endurance. But to those who wore them, they were a lifeline. On a muddy morning, with the roads a churned slurry and the fields slick with water and dung, a leather shoe would vanish in the muck before a single furrow was turned. Wooden clogs, with their thick soles and raised heels, kept the foot above the filth, offering a measure of protection from the worst the earth could throw at them. Sometimes, farmers wore them with thick woolen stockings. More often, their feet were bare, toughened by years of hardship. But the simplicity of the clog concealed a painful risk, one that turned each step into a gamble. Unlike modern shoes, these were carved by hand, often at home or by local craftsmen with little regard for fine finishing. The grain of the wood ran wild, and even the best-made clogs could develop cracks with time and use. A sudden misstep, the shock of a rock, or simply the slow rot of a damp season could cause the wood to split, sometimes with a soft, ominous sound, sometimes with a sharp, stinging snap. For the wearer, the consequences were immediate and brutal. The split edges would drive splinters up into the heel and sole of the foot, invisible daggers that turned a tool of protection into a device of torment. Splinters might be long and ragged, driven in with every step, or tiny and almost invisible, burrowing into the flesh where they festered for days or weeks. There was no easy way out. For the poor, clogs were expensive to replace, and a cracked pair might be worn for months, with rags stuffed inside in a vain attempt to block the worst of the splinters. The pain was constant, sharpest in the mornings when feet were swollen from yesterday's labors, dulled only by exhaustion or the numbing cold of winter. Children, too, suffered, their small feet forced into rough-hewn shoes handed down through siblings and neighbors, the cracks already beginning to widen. Some learned to ignore the pain, limping through chores with bloodied heels and bitten lips. Others resorted to home remedies: honey smeared on a wound, a poultice of plantain leaves, or a needle heated in the fire to pry out the wood. Infections were common, and the lucky healed with a scar. The unlucky faced festering wounds, abscesses, or even death if blood poisoning took hold. Clogs left their mark in more than scars. The very way people walked was shaped by the need to spare their feet. Medieval accounts tell of field workers shuffling, sliding their shoes along the ground, rather than risking a sharp stomp that might send a hidden splinter deeper. On market days, the tap-tap of wood on stone was the music of the working class, but always with a note of caution. A pause, a wince, a step drawn back as pain lanced up the leg. Socially, clogs were a badge of hardship as much as practicality. Nobles and wealthy townsfolk sometimes wore platform shoes for style, but only the poor clumped about in rough wood. In the church, the muddy, splintered shoes were left at the door, a silent reminder of the divide between those who toiled and those who prayed. For many, there was a peculiar pride in enduring the pain, in shrugging off a bloodied heel as just another cost of survival. Songs and jokes poked fun at the countryman's limp, but beneath the laughter was the hard truth. Wooden shoes spared you from the mud, but not from suffering. In time, clogs themselves became a symbol, a shorthand in art and literature for poverty, stubbornness, and resilience. Medieval laws in some towns even banned the wearing of clogs indoors, citing the damage their heavy soles did to stone floors and the ceaseless echo of their footsteps. Yet the poor had little choice. They wore their clogs until they fell apart, then patched them, then wore them some more. Even today, the descendants of these shoes remain in folk costume, celebrated as relics of a vanished world. But the reality for most was far from quaint. The medieval clog was as much a curse as a blessing, a daily reminder that every solution brought its own pain. With every step, a splinter, a small, sharp, unrelenting truth that survival never came easily. So the next time you slip your feet into the comfort of a modern shoe, think of the generations who came before, clumping through fields with mud caked to their knees, gritting their teeth as wood split and splinters worked their way deep into living flesh. Each scar told a story, not of fashion, but of necessity, of the endless, grinding struggle to stay one step ahead of the land that threatened always to swallow them whole. Beggars rapped. Feet in cloth and rope. Imagine life at the bottom of a medieval city, a world not of stone and glass, but of dirt, hunger, and endless uncertainty. Beneath the wealth of merchants and the prayers of priests, there are those who possess almost nothing. They wander the streets and alleys, unseen by most, their stories carried on the wind and trampled beneath the boots of the fortunate. Among these outcasts, even the luxury of a battered shoe is too much to hope for. Instead, the only barrier between flesh and earth is a strip of rag and a length of twine. This is how the poor, the beggars, and the wandering lost survived the cold and unforgiving world. Shoes were costly, a treasure that might cost months of labor, or luck, or charity rarely given. So feet were wrapped in whatever scraps could be scavenged, strips torn from ruined tunics, fragments of sacking found discarded in the gutter, worn linens traded in the alleys. Some rags came from the shrouds of the dead, cut by desperate hands, their origins better left unspoken. With careful, practiced fingers, beggars wound the cloth around bare feet, starting at the toes and working up toward the ankle. Layers were tied with bits of twine, rope, or even old leather thongs, anything strong enough to hold the rags in place against the friction of the street. There was no right or wrong way, only whatever worked for another day. Sometimes the rags slipped loose in the mud or tore open on sharp stones, leaving skin exposed to cold, rot, and the hazards of the city. The sensation was one of constant discomfort, dampness seeping in, mud clinging to every fold, stones bruising the soles, and wind cutting through any hope of warmth. In winter, rags froze stiff by morning. In summer, they stank of sweat and filth, soaked with whatever water or waste flooded the streets. The thin barrier offered little protection. To walk was to risk blisters, bleeding, and infections that festered unseen. The threat of foot rot and fungal disease hovered in every step. Once a sore started, it rarely healed clean. Yet there was no alternative. Children learned to wrap their feet as soon as they could walk, their tiny toes red and raw, their footsteps hesitant on the broken cobblestones. The old moved slowly, resting whenever the pain became too sharp. Mothers tied rags for their children first, sometimes walking barefoot themselves. The bravest tried to steal scraps from the market or beg a length of rope from a generous craftsman. Most relied on luck and endurance, day after day, season after season. The city itself seemed to conspire against them. Streets were not just dirty, but dangerous, littered with shards of pottery, bones, even nails and glass. Animal waste and spilled refuse mingled in puddles that never fully dried. The feet of beggars absorbed it all, every contaminant, every germ, every memory of suffering that seeped through the cloth and into open wounds. Disease followed poverty like a shadow, infections that swelled, fevered, and sometimes led to the slow blackening of flesh. There were no doctors for the poor, only hope, prayer, and the wisdom of elders who'd survived their own battles with pain. Some, when luck allowed, scavenged scraps of hide or tried to fashion soles from bits of wood. A broken sandal, thrown out by a wealthy household, was a prize beyond imagining. But these makeshift solutions rarely lasted. Most days, the beggar's foot was closer to the earth than to any real protection, feeling the chill, the wet, and the press of every stone. Yet, in the midst of this hardship, a kind of stubborn dignity endured. The poor helped each other, sharing what little they had. An old man might show a child how to double knot the rope for less chafing. A mother would exchange a clean cloth for a handful of lentils. Even the simplest gesture, helping to rewrap a neighbor's foot after a storm, became an act of quiet resistance against a world that refused to see them. Stories grew around these feet. Some said you could tell a person's entire life by the pattern of their wrappings, tight and careful for the cautious, loose and hurried for the desperate. It was a silent language, a code of survival written in rags and rope. No matter how filthy or torn, these bindings were shields against a world that demanded strength without mercy. Religious orders sometimes offered help, alms in the form of old linen, the rare gift of a cast-off shoe. On feast days, a monastery might lay out baskets of cloth strips and bread. These moments were rare, but never forgotten, small islands of relief in a sea of want. And still, the beggars walked on. Every step a lesson in pain and patience, every day a gamble against infection and the cold. There were those who lost toes or entire feet to rot, who limped for life, whose stories ended on the street, wrapped in the same rags they wore in life. But most simply kept going, refusing to be beaten by misery or shame. Today, it's easy to forget the simple, daily agonies that defined the lives of the poorest. Museums display shoes as artifacts, but the story of feet wrapped in cloth and rope is rarely told. Yet it is there, in every corner of history, an unbroken line of survival, ingenuity, and the will to endure. So when you see the smooth, modern pavement beneath your feet, remember those who walked before, who braved the world barefoot, but for a shield of rags and hope. Their pain was real, their strength astonishing, and their journey, though silent, is written in every step we take toward a more merciful world. Crusaders lost toes in cold weather. Marches. Picture a line of weary men marching into the wind, the sky iron gray above an endless stretch of mud and stone. Their armor clinks softly, the banners hang limp and wet, and beneath their cloaks, their feet throb with pain that never truly fades. These are the Crusaders, peasants and nobles alike, called by faith, greed, or glory, pushing eastward across frozen passes and waterlogged fields on their long road to Jerusalem. What history often glosses over is not just their battles, but the slow, daily destruction wrought by cold, exhaustion, and the shoes on their feet, shoes so thin and inadequate that every step toward the Holy Land risked a piece of their bodies left behind. The Crusaders' boot was a crude tool, fashioned quickly from rough leather or stitched together from whatever materials could be spared. There was no insulation, no clever lining, no layers of fur or wool, only a strip of hide between flesh and the merciless world. For the poor, boots were worn thin by months of marching before the journey had truly begun. For the rich, there might be a second pair, perhaps a little sturdier. But even the finest shoes of the age offered almost no real protection against the relentless cold. As winter pressed down on Europe and Anatolia, the cold seeped through the soles, numbing toes, then feet, then legs. Frostbite was not a medical term the Crusaders would have recognized, but they knew its bite all too well. It started as an ache, then a tingling, then a deadness so deep you'd think your foot had been replaced by stone. At first, men stumbled or limped, hoping to ignore the pain, but soon toes blackened, blisters formed, skin split, and infection set in. Some soldiers tried to bind their feet with rags or bits of wool, but most simply marched on. each step a negotiation with agony. The marches themselves were a test of endurance beyond imagining. Through the Alps, the Balkans, and the highlands of Anatolia, the Crusaders battled not only enemies, but the land itself. Snow drifted waist-high, icy winds cut through every seam in their clothing, and boots soaked through with melted ice and mud turned to dead weight. Night brought no relief. Fires were scarce, wood hard to find, and boots were sometimes worn even while sleeping, lest they freeze solid by morning. Soldiers huddled together for warmth, feet pressed to each other or buried under packs and saddles, desperate to hold on to every scrap of heat. It wasn't just the cold that claimed toes and feet. Days spent trudging through waterlogged trenches, mud, and frozen streams brought another enemy: trench rot, a slow decay that set in when skin never dried. Flesh turned white, then purple, then black. The stench of infection filled the air. Open sores blossomed into gaping wounds. Men woke to find toes fused together by pus, or so swollen they could barely slip their boots back on. In the worst cases, toes simply fell off, quietly, without ceremony, lost to rot and neglect. Those who lost their toes were lucky if that was all. Infection moved fast in a body weakened by hunger and exhaustion. What started in the foot could quickly climb the leg, filling the veins with poison. There were no doctors on the march, just other soldiers with knives, heated blades, or rough linen for binding wounds. Amputations, when performed, were brutal affairs done by moonlight, the victim held down by friends, a stick bitten between his teeth. Many never made it through the night. Those who survived limped into Jerusalem, forever changed, if they arrived at all. Chroniclers of the Crusades tell stories of great battles and acts of faith, of saints and kings, but in the margins there are hints of the daily toll. Letters home from nights speak of men who left their footprints in blood and skin, of boots so thin one could feel the pebbles as knives, of comrades left behind when they could walk no more. In the frozen passes, bodies piled up, boots half buried in snow, their owners missing more than just toes. Some, too weak to continue, lay down and simply never rose again. For the survivors, the scars endured long after the journey's end. The loss of toes or whole feet meant a permanent limp, a shuffling gait that set them apart. Some found pride in their wounds, proof of their devotion, their endurance, their place in the great story of Christendom. Others returned home crippled, unable to work the land or serve at court, forever marked by the cost of a crusade that history would turn into legend. Yet even in their suffering, there was resilience. Crusaders found ways to cope, stuffing boots with straw, wrapping feet in spare cloth, or walking barefoot when leather rotted away entirely. They shared warmth around dying campfires, told stories to pass the time, and prayed for deliverance, for sunrise, for the distant promise of Jerusalem's walls. Every step forward was a refusal to surrender, a testament to the stubborn hope that somewhere ahead, suffering would be redeemed by glory or by grace. Today, the loss of a toe is an accident, a tragedy easily prevented. Modern boots shield us from cold and mud. Medicine can rescue flesh from infection and rot. But on the long road to Jerusalem, every soldier marched with the knowledge that the greatest danger might not be a Saracen sword, but the silent, relentless bite of the earth beneath his feet. The Crusaders' journey was written not only in the blood of battle, but in the blisters, blackened toes, and the bones left behind in the snow. So the next time you lace up your boots or walk without pain across frozen ground, remember those who crossed half a continent with nothing but faith and a strip of leather for protection. Their sacrifice is buried not just in stories of conquest and loss, but in every small, unremembered agony that turned ambition into endurance, hope into survival, and flesh into legend. One frozen, battered footstep at a time, shoe shape dictated your rank. In a world where every gesture, every word, and every stitch of clothing marked your place in society, there was perhaps no symbol more quietly powerful or more revealing than the shoes on your feet. For centuries across medieval Europe, your shoes didn't just protect you from the mud or the cold. They told the world who you were, where you belonged, and how far you could hope to climb. In fact, the very shape of your shoes was dictated by law, by custom, and by the relentless choreography of status. It was a system so strict, so deeply woven into the fabric of life, that a mere point or curve at your toe could decide whether you were ignored, envied, or even arrested. At the lowest rungs of society stood the servants, men and women who toiled in kitchens, tended the horses, swept out the straw from drafty halls, and labored in the endless shadow of their masters. For them, the law was blunt. Shoes must be simple, functional, and always round toe. The shape wasn't just a matter of practicality. It was a visible, daily reminder that their role was to serve, not to be seen. Round-toe shoes, often made of coarse leather and hastily stitched, signaled humility, modesty, and acceptance of one's station. For the authorities, this shape was meant to discourage ambition. No servant should aspire to look like a lord. But up the social ladder, the rules changed. Among merchants, guildsmen, minor officials, and above all, the nobility, shoes became a canvas for extravagance and ambition. And nothing symbolized this more than the rise of the poulain, a shoe with an elongated, exaggerated pointed toe, so dramatic that it seemed almost theatrical. The longer and sharper the point, the higher the wearer's status. For the richest and most fashionable, these points grew to absurd lengths, sometimes over a foot long, curling like a scythe or thrusting boldly ahead. The most ostentatious shoes even required reinforcement rods made of whalebone, horn, or metal, hidden inside the leather to keep the tips from collapsing. Some nobles' poulains were so long they had to be tied up to the wearer's knees with silk cords to keep from tripping over themselves. To modern eyes, these pointed shoes may look outlandish, more suited to a fantasy film or a parody of vanity than the muddy streets of medieval towns. But in their time, they were deadly serious business. Every inch of extra point was a statement of wealth, of power, of defiance of the rules that governed the lower classes. The ability to wear a shoe so impractical, so blatantly unsuited to hard work, was its own display of privilege. The lord who strutted through court in his gleaming poulains sent a message to every onlooker. My time is not spent toiling. My body is not meant for labor. I walk on the world, and the world must make way. Sumptuary laws, those infamous rules that dictated what people could wear based on their social rank, were enforced with vigor, especially regarding shoes. Town councils and royal edicts spelled out in explicit detail which shapes were reserved for which classes. Servants caught wearing pointed shoes risked fines, public humiliation, or even dismissal. Merchants who pushed the limits with moderately pointed shoes could be reprimanded or excluded from guild privileges. Only those born into the upper ranks, or those who had bought titles and royal favor, could wear the most extravagant footwear. This obsession with shoe shape wasn't limited to England or France. Across Europe, from the Italian city-states to the courts of Burgundy and the Holy Roman Empire, the same pattern appeared. Round toes meant obedience and subservience. Points meant authority, glamour, and, sometimes, dangerous ambition. Church authorities often condemned the fashion, railing in sermons against devilish vanity and satanic points. But even bishops and abbots were known to sneak a pair of stylish poulains beneath their robes. For the common people, the drama of shoe shape was an endless source of fascination and resentment. Peasants and servants would gossip about the latest excesses at court, laugh at the stories of noblemen caught in the mud, their long toes dragging, or mock the nobles who could barely kneel in church without their shoes jutting into the aisle. At the same time, there was envy, a longing to escape the round-toe prison, to be noticed, to be more than just another nameless face in the crowd. Yet, for all its absurdity, the system was ruthlessly effective. In a crowded marketplace or a busy street, a glance at someone's shoes could reveal more about their life than a dozen questions. The shape of your toes was your passport, your badge, your warning to others not to overstep invisible boundaries. Marriages, job offers, and even punishments could hinge on the subtle signal sent by a pair of shoes. Even as fashions shifted and new styles emerged, the message remained. The foot was not just a tool for moving through the world. It was a billboard for your rank, your worth, your permission to exist on certain terms. For many, that meant enduring the humiliation of round-toe shoes year after year, never allowed to dream beyond the limits imposed at birth. For a privileged few, it meant teetering through life on a razor's edge of fashion, always chasing the next, more extreme point, sometimes literally propped up by rods and wires, always on display, never quite secure. The bones of medieval Europe, unearthed centuries later by archaeologists, sometimes still bear the marks of these distinctions. Toes warped by years of pointed shoes, the bones bent or compressed by impossible angles, a silent testament to the price paid for status and style. For others, the humble round toe remains, blunt, practical, and invisible, forgotten as the lives they once carried. So, the next time you slip your feet into shoes of your own choosing, remember, there was a time when the shape of your toes announced your fate, when a point or a curve was as binding as a chain. The story of medieval shoes is the story of all the ways we try to define and divide, to climb, and to keep others down. It is a story written not in ink or proclamation, but in leather, in bone, and in the endless silent language of footsteps across history. Slippery mud made walking a nightmare. Imagine waking to the sound of rain hammering on a thatched roof, the gray light of dawn slanting through cracks in the shutters. For most in the medieval world, this meant one thing. The long struggle with mud was about to begin again. Mud wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an enemy that greeted you at your door, reached for you at every step, and never truly let go. It was everywhere, on roads, in fields, in castle courtyards, and worst of all, in kitchens and workrooms where slick floors could turn even the smallest errand into a battle against gravity. Walking anywhere at all, was a test of endurance and luck. There was no such thing as a treaded sole, no rubber grip, no clever patterned bottom to your shoes. Most footwear was made from soft, untreated leather, stitched into simple turn shoes or heavy clogs with flat, smooth soles. These slid across wet wood and stone with all the security of a sheet of ice. For the wealthy, it was a small indignity, but for the poor, who often had to trudge miles in rain or snow just to reach a market or field, it was a daily torment. Village roads were the worst. Packed earth quickly became a sucking morass, devouring shoes, carts, and even livestock. After a storm, it was not uncommon to see an entire path transformed into a series of boot-shaped holes, each one a small grave for lost footwear. Children learned to dart across the surface, aiming for patches of straw or cobblestone that offered a moment's respite, while adults moved in slow, careful procession, eyes fixed on the ground, muscles tense for the inevitable slip. Shoes, even new ones, didn't last long in these conditions. The mud worked its way into every seam and stitch, softening leather and rotting thread. The more a person struggled to pull free, the more the earth seemed to cling. There are stories of villagers reaching home after a day in the fields with one shoe gone entirely, sucked off by the mud and lost until the ground dried in summer. Some, desperate to keep their only pair from ruin, went barefoot through the muck, sacrificing skin and pride to save what little protection they had left. Inside the castle, things weren't much better. Kitchens were notoriously treacherous. A mixture of spilled broth, boiling water, animal fat, and muddy footprints from servants running in and out. Cooks and scullery maids learned to move with a cautious, sliding gait, bracing themselves against tables and walls. A single careless step could send someone sprawling, knives clattering to the floor, boiling pots tipping dangerously close. Scars and bruises were the hidden price of a well-fed court. Out in the courtyards, the endless foot traffic of soldiers, horses, and laborers churned dirt into a slick, glistening bog. Rainwater pooled in ruts and gullies, creating traps that swallowed wheels and tripped the unwary. Even the stone steps leading to a lord's hall could become a hazard. Green moss and mud collected in every crevice, waiting to send nobles and commoners alike tumbling in front of a jeering crowd. Falls were so common that medieval records contain dozens of accidental injury reports, some fatal, all humiliating. Travel was a test of patience and ingenuity. Pilgrims and traders traveling in groups would move with arms locked, supporting each other over the most dangerous stretches. Some villages tried to lay wooden boards or bundles of reeds across the worst patches, but these soon vanished into the ooze or were stolen for firewood. In the cities, the wealthy might hire porters to carry them through the filth, riding high above the mud while servants ruined their own shoes and their health below. The psychological toll was as real as the physical danger. People came to dread the long months of rain, the endless cold, the sense that no matter how careful you were, the ground itself was waiting to drag you down. Shoes became an object of anxiety, patched and mended until they barely resembled their original shape. Mud seeped into homes, ruined clothing, and brought disease, spreading rot and misery as efficiently as any army. Even in moments of rest, the effects lingered. At the fireside, people picked dried mud from their feet and nails, rubbing warmth back into frozen toes. Children giggled at the squelching sounds their shoes made, but for adults, every ruined pair was a loss. A cost measured in coin and comfort that few could truly afford. It was a world where a simple walk to the market could become a minor epic, a journey through a landscape determined to humble even the most careful traveler. And yet, life went on. People adapted as best they could. They invented clever ways to tie their shoes tighter, stuffed straw inside to soak up moisture, and shared tales of particularly disastrous tumbles. Songs and riddles mocked the mud, while saints' prayers begged for a dry patch of earth and a safe return home. Today, the mud is mostly tamed. Paved roads and waterproof boots have rendered it a mere nuisance for most. But in every patch of soft earth, every slick step on a rainy night, there lingers the memory of those centuries when mud was a daily trial, a relentless adversary that tested the spirit as much as the body. The nightmare of slippery medieval mud may be gone, but its lessons remain. Humility, endurance, and the never-ending human struggle to rise. One careful, slippery step at a time. Inns required you to remove shoes. Picture the world of medieval travel. Roads rutted with mud, the smell of livestock thick in the air, and the promise of a warm fire at the end of a long, exhausting journey. For merchants, pilgrims, and wanderers, the sight of an inn or tavern sign was a lifeline. Shelter, food, perhaps a mug of ale and a story by the hearth. But behind the welcoming glow of candlelight and the sound of laughter, there was an unexpected and quietly unnerving custom that shaped the experience for every weary traveler. The rule, enforced in countless inns across Europe, that required guests to remove their shoes upon entry. On the surface, the practice seemed practical. Shoes caked with mud and dung were a threat to the fragile rush matting and straw-strewn floors. For innkeepers, already struggling to keep dirt and pests at bay, the rule was simple. Leave your shoes by the door, then enter. Sometimes a wooden rack stood ready, or a pile of woven mats, or simply a stretch of bare, hard-packed earth beside the threshold. A small ritual evolved. Shoes slipped off, feet wiped, a brief shiver as toes met the chill of stone or straw. After days of travel, removing your shoes might have brought a moment's relief, until you realized what waited inside. The communal mats where dozens, sometimes hundreds of feet, had rested before you were alive with hazards. The mingled warmth and moisture from bare feet and damp shoes made perfect breeding grounds for lice, fleas, and disease. Even before you crossed the threshold, the smell told you what was coming. A pungent mixture of old sweat, wet leather, rotting straw, and something sharper, an odor that clung to every corner, never quite masked by herbs or the sweet smoke of the fire. People who rarely washed their feet now pressed them together in public, hoping no one would notice the grime, the fungal infections, or the sores hidden beneath. The risk went beyond discomfort. Lice and fleas, thriving in the shared mats, moved from traveler to traveler with ease, infesting shoes, clothing, and bedding. For those unlucky enough to arrive with a wound or blister, infection was almost inevitable. It was not uncommon for guests to leave an inn sicker than when they'd arrived, scratching at fresh bites or nursing festering sores acquired from a single night's stay. And as much as innkeepers tried to control the spread, beating the mats, sprinkling them with herbs, sweeping the floors, there was only so much that could be done in a world without true sanitation. Social discomfort was just as real. In the common rooms, everyone sat or slept together, feet exposed to the flickering light and the eyes of strangers. Any mark of disease or deformity, any lingering smell, became a source of silent shame. The wealthy, sometimes allowed to keep their boots, sat apart. But for most, there was no choice. Travelers learned to avoid eye contact, to keep their feet tucked under cloaks, to hope the night would pass quickly. Gossip about particularly foul-smelling or disease-ridden guests spread from village to village, another invisible cost of life on the road. For the chronically poor, whose shoes might be stuffed with straw or patched until they barely held together, the rule was doubly humiliating. Every flaw was on display. Children winced as they peeled away wet, stinking shoes. Old men hobbled in agony as they exposed calluses and wounds. And yet, no one dared protest. The rule was a fact of travel, as inescapable as the cold or the hunger that haunted every mile. Yet, there was a strange equality in the custom. Whether you arrived as a merchant with a heavy purse or as a laborer with little more than hope, your shoes came off all the same. The ritual became part of the shared hardship of the road, a reminder that, for a night at least, everyone was vulnerable, exposed, and equal in discomfort. Over time, as roads improved and personal hygiene became more valued, the rule began to fade. Mats gave way to hard floors, shoes stayed on in some places, and new fears replaced the old. But for centuries, the memory lingered, of shoes stacked by the door, of mats alive with the movements of unseen pests, and of the strange, uneasy closeness that came from sleeping, eating, and suffering together, barefoot and exposed, beneath the uncertain shelter of a stranger's roof. Next time you check into a hotel and slip off your shoes in the privacy of your own room, remember the long line of travelers before you, sharing more than just stories on the road. The sound of shoes dropping at the door was not just the end of a journey. It was the beginning of another, quieter ordeal. One measured in discomfort, endurance, and the simple hope of making it through the night unscathed. No shoelaces, just leather straps that broke. Imagine the feeling of setting out on a long walk across rough ground, fields, muddy roads, crowded town markets, knowing that everything depends on your shoes. Now imagine that those shoes are little more than stiff slabs of leather, held to your feet, not by the secure knot of a modern shoelace, but by a few thin, brittle straps of rawhide. This is the quiet struggle of every medieval traveler, worker, and wanderer, not just keeping the shoes on your feet, but praying they will hold together, one step at a time. Shoelaces, as we know them, woven cords strong enough to bear a tight knot, easy to replace, resistant to the grind of travel, simply didn't exist. Instead, medieval shoes relied on leather thongs or straps, sliced from leftover hides. These were tough at first, but quickly dried, stiffened, and frayed under constant use. Their strength depended on the animal, the weather, and luck. Most people tied their shoes with a few simple wraps, looping the straps through holes in the leather, then knotting them tightly across the top of the foot or around the ankle. The knots had to be tight enough to keep the shoe from slipping off, but not so tight that they cut into the flesh. Every morning was a negotiation with discomfort, and every outing a gamble. For the poor, replacing a broken strap wasn't just an inconvenience, it could spell disaster. Extra leather was scarce, hoarded for repairs, and scraps were used and reused until there was nothing left but brittle slivers. A snapped strap could leave you barefoot miles from home, forced to limp on with rags or nothing at all, feet quickly cut, bruised, and exposed to mud and disease. There was no roadside shop selling replacements, no friendly cobbler with spare parts. You made do with what you had, twisting the broken ends together, tying knots until the strap shrank to a useless stub, or scavenging for string, rope, or even woven grass to improvise a temporary fix. Travelers, merchants, messengers, pilgrims knew the dread of that sudden, unmistakable snap. The sound could come in the middle of a lonely forest, a rain-soaked field, or the crowded approach to a city gate. In an instant, your shoe hung loose, flapping or falling away with every step. If you had no means to fix it, you were forced to walk half-shod, one foot protected, the other at the mercy of stones, cold, and filth. Blisters formed in minutes, and wounds soon followed. What began as a journey of hope could end in limping agony, all because a single strap failed. Leather straps were not just fragile, they were fickle. In wet weather, they swelled and stretched, slipping loose at the worst moments. In dry weather, they shrank and cracked, growing brittle as old wood. Everyday life demanded constant vigilance. Check the knots, retie the ends, keep an eye out for cracks or splits. Children learned young to watch their feet, and parents carried spare bits of leather whenever possible. But even then, there was never enough to go around. Those lucky enough to afford better shoes sometimes fared no better. Wealthier townsfolk wore finer leather, decorated with cuts and slits for style. But the straps remained thin and delicate. Knights and nobles, whose boots were taller and sometimes fancier, still relied on the same rawhide ties. And a snapped strap in the mud before battle or during a long ride could leave even the highborn at a standstill. Some tried to reinforce their straps with metal buckles or toggles, but these were expensive and prone to rust. Most simply lived with the risk, and with the bitter reality that shoes, like everything else, were temporary. When a strap broke, resourcefulness became the rule. Some wrapped their feet with rope or twine borrowed from other tasks. Others cut strips from clothing or scavenged thread from a neighbor. In market towns, beggars waited near the cobblers, hoping for cast-off scraps just strong enough for a day or two. Soldiers in the field sometimes plaited grass or nettle into emergency ties, knowing the rough fibers would shred their skin, but grateful for any protection at all. Pilgrims bound their shoes with anything they could find, hoping to reach the next shrine before the last strap gave out. This daily, quiet battle with fragile straps shaped medieval life in ways we rarely imagine. The rhythm of work and travel was interrupted by sudden, unexpected failures. People learned to move carefully, not just for dignity or pride, but for survival. Because a broken shoe could mean lost wages, missed appointments, or injury that never truly healed. The landscape itself, mud, thorns, stones, icy puddles, became an enemy that could defeat you with a single snap. Even in the home, the ritual of shoe tying was fraught. Children fumbled with stiff, stubborn cords, and old hands trembled as they knotted leather already stretched to its limit. The process became a lesson in patience, endurance, and humility. Every knot was a small act of hope, that the straps would last one more day, one more journey, one more crossing of the market or the field. In time, technology would change. Shoelaces would be invented, first as woven cords, then as the tough, reliable strings we know today. But for hundreds of years, people lived and walked with the knowledge that at any moment, what stood between them and the unforgiving ground was a strip of animal hide, always one step from failure, always threatening to leave them barefoot in a world that gave no second chances. So next time you tie your shoes, feeling the snug, reliable hold of a modern lace, remember the ancient struggle of those who came before. Their journeys were measured not just in miles, but in knots, snaps, and the daily, stubborn fight to keep moving forward, even as the world did its best to leave them behind. Travelers walked 20+ miles a day in ruined shoes. Picture the rising sun stretching across an endless, rutted road. You are a pilgrim, a merchant, or a wandering laborer, one among thousands moving between villages, cities, and distant shrines in medieval Europe. You carry your life on your back, hope in your heart, and your fate tied to the thin, battered shoes strapped to your feet. Each morning begins with the sting of old blisters, the ache of tired muscles, and the grim knowledge that you must walk another 20 miles or more before you can rest. For the roads are long, the world is wild, and the only thing between you and the earth is a pair of shoes that may not last the week. Medieval travel was a world apart from anything we know today. There were no buses, no trains, no carriages for the poor. To journey was to walk, mile after mile, through mud, rain, dust, and snow, beneath the sun's punishing glare or the battering of wind and hail. Shoes, when you had them, were crude affairs, a thin slice of leather for a sole, stitched hastily to an upper, sometimes reinforced with a double layer if you were lucky or wealthy. But for most travelers, shoes wore out fast. After a few days on the road, the seams unraveled, the soles thinned, and the world beneath pressed in. Pilgrims and merchants alike left home with new shoes, but even the best pair could be destroyed by a week of marching across sharp stones and tangled roots. Once the first hole appeared, it grew with every step. Water seeped in, mud caked around your toes, and stones drove into your flesh. Blood and sweat mingled in the dark, cramped space of the shoe, softening the leather and breaking the will of even the strongest. Soon, the only thing holding your shoe together was faith and a tangle of makeshift repairs. Resourcefulness became a necessity. When shoes split or soles fell off, travelers stopped by the roadside, hands trembling from exhaustion, to patch them with whatever was at hand. Rags torn from cloaks, bits of rope, even woven grass or the bark of nearby trees. Some travelers carried scraps of old cloth for this very reason, knowing that by the third or fourth day, bleeding feet were a certainty. They wound the rags tightly around blisters and open wounds, tying knots so that the bandages would hold through mud and rain. The rags became black with grime and red with blood, but there was no other choice. To stop was to fall behind, to lose the day's light, to risk bandits, wolves, or the crushing loneliness of the dark. The pain was constant and deep, a throb that became a kind of rhythm with the road. Some found relief in the numbness that crept in after hours of walking. Others gritted their teeth and pushed on, knowing that the goal, a distant shrine, a market, a new life, lay only at the end of the road. Stories tell of pilgrims who arrived at holy sites with feet so mangled that they had to be carried the last mile, of merchants whose toes fused together under makeshift wrappings, of mothers who walked barefoot beside children rather than slow the journey for lack of a proper shoe. The road itself was an adversary. In summer, it baked under the sun, burning souls through the thin leather. In winter, the earth froze as hard as iron, each step a blow that sent shockwaves up aching legs. Rivers had to be forded, stones crossed, brambles pushed aside. Every mile was a test, not just of endurance, but of hope. At night, travelers peeled away their rags to examine new wounds, gashes, raw patches, swollen joints. The bravest cleaned their feet as best they could in streams or puddles, hoping to stave off infection. But for many, the wounds festered, and every morning the pain was sharper than before. Yet, travel was unavoidable. For pilgrims, the journey was penance and devotion, a sacred hardship meant to purify the soul. For merchants, it was survival, the only way to carry goods to market or news to distant towns. The roads swelled with people during feast days and fairs, each limping figure a testament to stubborn endurance. Inns were few, cobblers even fewer, and the price of a new shoe was beyond reach for most. So people shared advice, swapped rags, and sometimes even traded shoes mid-journey, mismatched pairs shuffling onward to new destinations. Those who fell behind were rarely remembered. The ditches at the roadside sometimes held bones, the last remnants of travelers who collapsed, unable to go on. For every successful arrival, countless more suffered in silence, their stories unrecorded except in the worn grooves of the roads themselves. Chroniclers wrote of miracles at shrines, but the true miracles were often quieter. A stranger sharing a scrap of cloth, a farmer inviting a limping traveler to warm by the fire, a child carrying a weary parent the last few steps to safety. Despite the pain, there was camaraderie in the hardship. On the open road, differences of class and birth faded in the face of shared struggle. Travelers recognized each other by their gait, by the stoic set of their jaws, by the blackened, bleeding rags that covered their feet. They sang songs to dull the ache, told stories by moonlight, and promised themselves that the next step would bring them closer to rest, to healing, to grace. When at last they reached their goal, a bustling city, a market square, a holy site glittering with candles, travelers wept, not just for joy, but for relief. They removed their shoes, what was left of them, and washed their feet in the cold water of a fountain or river. For some, the journey left scars that never healed. For others, it was a memory woven into the fabric of their lives, a story of pain and perseverance that they would tell long after the wounds had faded. Today, we travel with comfort unimaginable to those who came before us. We forget how much of history was written in blisters and blood, in footsteps that crossed continents with nothing but hope and a ruined shoe. The next time you walk a smooth road or slip on a sturdy pair of shoes, remember the travelers who came before, who faced every mile with courage, resourcefulness, and a quiet, aching faith that each step, no matter how painful, was worth the price. Wearing the wrong shoes could get you whipped. Beneath the glittering surface of medieval society, where pageants and banquets dazzled, and nobles strutted in silks and gold, there was another world, one of shadow, dirt, and quiet terror. Here, every rule mattered, and every rule was watched. For those who served, nothing about life was truly their own, not even the shoes on their feet. In a world obsessed with hierarchy, the wrong shoes weren't just a mistake, they were a crime, and the punishment could be swift, savage, and unforgettable. The rules were everywhere, posted on the walls of manors and town halls, repeated in the whispers of markets and kitchens. The sumptuary laws were clear. Only those born to privilege could wear shoes with fine points, rich dyes, delicate straps, or anything that smacked of noble luxury. For servants, for the poor, for those who cleaned the floors and hauled the water, shoes were to be blunt, round-toed, plain, and drab. This wasn't about fashion. It was about power. About keeping the lines between us and them sharp enough to cut. But temptation and ambition are old as humanity. The sight of a nobleman's curled shoes, soft leather, shining buckles, a footstep that announced importance with every click, was enough to spark longing, envy, and sometimes a dangerous spark of defiance. Maybe a discarded pair of shoes found behind a tavern, or a clever servant who stitched scraps into something a little finer than what was allowed. Maybe it was just the urge to be seen as more than a shadow. But if a servant dared to step out in anything that even resembled noble style, the eyes of the household would notice, and so would the law. Punishment was not just a deterrent, it was a ritual of humiliation. Sometimes, the offense would be discovered at a morning inspection. A pointed toe peeking from beneath a servant's hem, a colored lace, or a bit of too soft leather. The lord steward or the housekeeper would stop everything, summon the household, and drag the offender into the courtyard. There, in front of their peers, sometimes before the entire village, the servant would be forced to kneel, remove the offending shoes, and confess their mockery. The shoes might be destroyed, burned, or nailed to a post as a warning, but that was only the beginning. Many times, the punishment was public shaming, a parade through the streets, bare feet exposed, servants jeered and spat upon by townsfolk told they were upstarts, or mocking their betters. Sometimes, the punishment was harsher. In many manors and towns, the master had the right to order a whipping. The servant would be tied to a post or a tree, stripped to the waist, and lashed for every eye to see. The message was clear. You do not cross the line, not even at your toes. Your place is set. Your pain is a lesson to others. These punishments were not rare. Court records from England, France, Italy, and beyond contain case after case. Servants whipped for wearing colored slippers. Apprentices beaten for copying the pointed poulens of their masters. Young girls shamed for decorating their shoes with bits of ribbon. Chroniclers even record cases where the servant's family was punished alongside them, shunned or fined for failing to teach humility. In cities, guilds would send inspectors to root out fashion offenses among apprentices, issuing beatings, fines, or blacklisting those who dared to dream above their station. The cruelty went deeper than just pain. The ritual of punishment was meant to break spirit and hope. The servant's humiliation was a spectacle, a reminder to every watcher that ambition would be crushed, that the social order was more important than the individual. Children were made to watch, learning early that the cost of pride was pain, and that mercy was rarely given to those born with nothing. Yet for all its brutality, the system could never fully erase the longing to rise, to belong, to step out of one's assigned role. There are stories, quiet and defiant, of servants who stitched forbidden shoes in secret, worn only for a few moments of stolen pride. Of mothers who hid scraps of colored cloth for daughters. Of friends who distracted overseers just long enough for a forbidden step to pass unseen. The memory of pain was heavy, but so was the hunger for dignity. With time, as old orders crumbled and new ideas of equality took root, the worst of these punishments faded. The laws that governed shoes, clothes, even dreams lost their teeth. But the stories remain, buried in the records, whispered in the memories of families who endured and survived. They remind us that something as simple as a shoe was never just about leather or laces. It was about the power to walk as yourself, to choose, to hope. So the next time you tie your shoes and step outside without fear, remember, there were those who suffered for a luxury we take for granted. Their pain is a part of the path we walk now, every day, in freedom. Toe injuries were everywhere. Close your eyes and imagine stepping out of a medieval cottage at dawn. The ground is hard, the air is sharp, and you brace yourself for another day of labor. On the farm, in the market, or at the forge. You glance down at your feet, thinly protected by worn leather shoes, little more than a second skin. You know, deep in your bones, that danger lies ahead. For in this world, your toes are among the most vulnerable parts of your body, a fact proven by the endless stories of pain, bruises, and shattered bone that haunt the annals of the past. Toe injuries in the Middle Ages were so common, so universally feared, that they became part of the daily conversation, a shared anxiety woven into the fabric of every village and workshop. The humble foot, and especially its delicate toes, bore the brunt of a world with no safety gear, no steel caps, and precious little mercy. Shoes, when worn at all, were soft and thin, barely enough to shield flesh from the hazards of work. Every day was a tightrope walk through danger. For the laboring classes, farmers, blacksmiths, woodcutters, builders, the threat was constant. A moment's distraction, a slip of the hand, and a dropped hammer or axe could mean agony. Toes were mangled by heavy stones, crushed under the iron bands of cartwheels, stubbed to the bone against hidden roots and jagged cobblestones. Livestock, so vital to survival, were an ever-present threat. A startled horse, a stubborn ox, or a clumsy pig could slam a hoof down with the force to shatter bone and tear skin. There are tales from the time of toes severed in the churned mud of the barnyard, of men who lost the use of their feet entirely in a single, unlucky instant. In the cramped chaos of medieval towns, danger multiplied. Narrow lanes teemed with hand carts, barrows, and runaway livestock. The press of the market made accidents inevitable. Fishmongers and bakers alike nursed purpled, swollen toes after long days hauling baskets and barrels. In workshops, the problem was even worse. A misaligned chisel or the careless swing of a mallet, and blood would stain the straw underfoot. Scribes, chroniclers, and physicians recorded the carnage with a mix of resignation and dark humor, as if toe injuries were as much a part of life as rain or hunger. But the pain did not end with the initial blow. Recovery, in a world with crude medicine and little time for rest, was slow, imperfect, and often incomplete. The unlucky found their toes swelling, blackening, or festering. Medieval healers prescribed poultices of honey, vinegar, and herbs to draw out infection. But the risk of gangrene loomed with every injury. There was no way to stitch bone or set tiny joints. More often than not, the body healed itself, awkwardly, painfully, leaving behind twisted, misshapen toes that ached every time the weather changed. The social costs were as severe as the physical. To lose the use of your toes was to lose mobility, independence, and dignity. Walking became a halting, painful task. Running, climbing, or even standing still too long could bring tears to the eyes of the toughest laborer. A bad foot could mean loss of work, dependence on family, or outright abandonment if resources were scarce. The rhythm of medieval life left little room for the slow or disabled. Some tried to fashion makeshift protection, wrapping toes in rags, stuffing shoes with wool, or binding broken digits with strips of bark or leather. But nothing truly replaced the absent toe caps of later centuries. Shoes remained soft, flexible, and vulnerable. Archaeologists today unearth skeletons from medieval graveyards with broken, fused, or missing toe bones, silent evidence of lives marked by pain. Toe injuries cut across class lines, though the wealthy fared only slightly better. While nobles might avoid the hardest labor, their pointed shoes offered even less protection. During feasts and tournaments, there were accidents aplenty. Tables overturned in merriment, horses rearing in narrow courtyards, servants jostling through crowded kitchens. Even in the stone corridors of castles, dropped flagstones or the careless tread of a guest could bring agony. For children, barefoot play on the village green or in the barn led to a lifetime of crooked toes and awkward gaits. The constant threat left its mark on culture. Old songs and rhymes warned children to watch their steps, while folk cures and superstitions multiplied. Some claimed rubbing garlic or onion on a wounded toe would ward off evil spirits and infection. Others swore by cold water from the town well, or the touch of a saint's relic pressed to swollen flesh. Communities came together to care for the injured, but recovery was slow and often incomplete. Despite it all, life pressed on. People limped to market, hobbled to fields, or hunkered at the fireside to pick at their wounds in silence. To live in the medieval world was to know the constant risk of pain, the slow crawl of healing, and the nagging awareness that another accident was always waiting. And through it all, the courage to keep moving, step by battered step, became an unspoken badge of endurance. Today, we take for granted the armor that protects our feet, steel toes, thick soles, even cushioned insoles. But in every modern shoe is an echo of the past, of the millions who walked before us, risking pain and hardship with every step. Their scars are hidden now, buried with the bones of the past, but their story remains, a testament to human resilience, to the struggle and the suffering that shaped the world beneath our feet. So next time you drop something near your toes and flinch at the thought of pain, remember those who couldn't avoid it. Remember the daily courage of lives built on fragile, unprotected feet, and the slow, stubborn healing that followed, one aching toe at a time. You couldn't complain. Shoes were a luxury. In the medieval world, the idea of comfort was nearly foreign, and luxury was a word reserved for kings. For ordinary people, peasants, laborers, even many merchants, shoes were not just a part of daily dress, but a symbol of rare fortune and social standing. Most could expect to own only a single pair in their lives, maybe two if they were extraordinarily lucky. The shoes might be stiff, cracked, full of holes, or painfully misshapen from years of use, yet they were cherished all the same. Even the most battered, ill-fitting shoes represented a precious buffer between bare skin and a world of sharp stones, filth, and biting cold. To complain about such a gift was unthinkable. In the eyes of your family, your neighbors, and the community at large, showing any dissatisfaction with your shoes, no matter how uncomfortable, smelly, or ruinous to your feet, would be seen as the height of ungratefulness. Children were sternly taught not to whine about sore toes or blisters, and adults bore their pain in silence, knowing that a single pair had to last through season after season of rain, snow, and mud. In many families, shoes were stored with reverence, tucked away at night, dried carefully by the fire, patched and repatched with whatever scraps could be found. Even those whose shoes were little more than rags clinging to their feet counted themselves fortunate. To have shoes at all meant you were shielded from the worst that nature and society could throw at you. Barefoot children were everywhere, running through muddy lanes, their feet calloused and cut, enduring frostbite in the winter and infections in the summer. Parents watched helplessly, wishing they could provide just a little more protection, a little more comfort. Complaining about the fit, the smell, or the pain would earn you no sympathy, only scorn. Grumbling marked you as spoiled, weak, or blind to your blessings. Communities judged harshly, for hardship was universal, and suffering was to be endured without complaint. Those who dared to voice their discomfort were often reminded, sometimes sharply, of how many people went entirely barefoot, risking disease, injury, and even death for lack of proper footwear. The silent endurance of pain became a point of pride. Folk wisdom taught that a grateful heart never complains, and parents would remind their children to give thanks for every patch and every sole, no matter how thin. The memory of those with nothing pressed close, the beggar's cracked feet on the church steps, the orphan limping through the cold. Stories circulated of people too poor to bury their dead with shoes, or who sold their last pair for food in the leanest winters. These were the reminders that even misery could always be worse, and that every possession, however humble, was a gift to be cherished. So if you found yourself limping with blisters or wincing at the cold, you simply endured. There were no words for such complaints, and little patience for those who voiced them. Comfort was not a right, but a distant dream, and the mere act of slipping battered leather over your feet each morning was a small miracle of survival. In a world where luxury was measured not in riches, but in the simple possession of a single pair of shoes, gratitude was not optional. It was the price of belonging, and the quiet code of endurance that carried whole generations across stone, snow, and time.